Chapter 1. Chapter text. It's not that it's a bad idea. In all honesty, Ezran thinks it's a well thought out, completely reasonable, perfectly sound idea that could solve a lot of his own problems, Callum's problems, and Catullus' problems, in one fell swoop, if it works, that is. It's a little risky, he'll admit, but it's not the same as, say, running away from home at 10 years old with his brother and a Moon Shadow elf assassin, whose mission was to kill him, to return a dragon egg in the midst of a centuries-long war, and hey, they'd managed that all right. Compared to that mess, politics should be easy, right? Right. Ezran wrinkles his nose. The light in his father's study, he reminds himself, is dim. It's probably terrible for his eyes to be writing such a lengthy letter by candlelight, but it's the one place his crown guard won't follow him and he needs the privacy. 3 years ago, when he'd taken his place on the Catolan throne, he'd always assumed that the aftermath of a war would be easier than the war itself, but there are wounds on both sides that, even now, people can't seem to let go. Back then, it had sounded easy. Callum and Rayla would return Zym to his mother, and the act of a human prince returning the heir to the dragon throne would bring peace. The end. But pig-headedness was, and still is, heavy on both sides of the border. There's so much prejudice between elves and humans that, even now, negotiations are slow and treaties signings are stilted. Heck, it's been 3 years, and the soldiers on his crown guard still watch Rayla, wary and apprehensive of her every move. Rayla, for her part, takes it maturely and lets their bigotry run off her like water off a duck. She's been traveling with Callum the whole time, mediating treaties and negotiations with him as an example of the friendship that could be. They visit often enough, and one would think that, if his guards pulled their heads out of their butts, they might notice the way Callum and Rayla treat each other, that is, with trust and respect. Callum's a powerful archmage now, and while she's technically not one anymore, Rayla's still a trained assassin. If they were mad enough and they wanted to, Ezran has no doubts that they would be capable of seriously hurting each other and more, but the point is that they don't. They have their arguments sometimes, sure, but on the whole, they are friends, who care deeply for each other and take care of each other the way friends should. The way their people should. The idea had hit him the last time they were here. They'd been sparring in the courtyard, which Ezran remembers thinking was weird, because he's known Callum all his life, and even when it was a requirement to learn how to fight, he'd been terrible at it. Now, all of a sudden, he was happy and eager. He'd had to see it. Callum's 18 now. He's still scrawny by 18-year-old standards, but he's grown taller than Rayla, horns don't count, he remembers thinking inwardly, she has to look up to meet his eyes now, something Ezran hadn't noticed until Rayla put one of her blades in his hand that day. She'd given him this look that was a little like a smirk mixed with something else, something coy. Callum's own smile was more eager than it was anything else, but that same energy was there. No magic, she'd said, holding her blade at the ready. Callum had smirked back, flicking the blade in his hand into its hook form with a deft shorty that Ezran didn't think he'd ever even had. I won't need it, he'd said, his voice smug, flirty. Ezran remembers the way he'd blinked, the realization that had dawned on him when Callum and Rayla had charged at each other with identical grins, the O that had formed on his lips as they taunted each other in mid-spar. He'd cornered Callum about it afterwards. He'd waited for Rayla to leave first, but he caught the way his brother watched her hips sway as she sauntered back into the keep, saw the soft little smile that lifted the corners of his lips, recognized the look in his eye as the same one from the days he used to pine after Claudia. Ezran honestly thinks it's outrageous he hadn't noticed earlier. So, how long have you and Rayla been a thing? He'd asked him, smirking. Callum had frowned at him and dabbed at the sweat on his brow. What do you mean a thing? To this day, Ezran remembers how carefully he'd considered his next words. How long have you two been in love with each other? Thinking about it now, it's hilarious, but at the time, Callum's reaction was such a mess that Ezran had to wonder whether his brother thought he could pull one over on him, or if Callum was genuinely just that clueless. Wait. Callum had said, ears going bright red beneath his mop of brown hair. In love, Ez, come on, don't be ridiculous. Now, Ezran's young, but he's not an idiot. He'd pressed his lips together like he was trying to hold back a laugh and said, are you being serious? I don't know where you'd even get the idea, Callum had sputtered, looking everywhere. Ezran had noticed, but at him. I should go wash up. Yeah, I'm gonna do that, so I'll see you at dinner. He didn't wait for an answer, rather, he half walked, half ran back into the keep, leaving Ezran smirking after him in the courtyard. That was 6 weeks ago. They'd come to mediate a meeting between the council and an emissary of Earthblood elves regarding a mining operation, and literally the following day, Ezran had almost introduced his forehead to the table mid-meeting while the Catolian Council and the Earthblood elves talked and shouted over themselves in an attempt to do anything but actually listen to each other. If only there was a way to show them that peace between both parties was possible, Ezran remembers thinking. If only there was an example of a peaceful union between elves and humans that he could shove in their stupid, stubborn faces. He'd caught sight of Callum and Rayla, then. Caught the way they looked just as frustrated as he did, but, more importantly, caught the way they stood together, elbows bumping accidentally on purpose, whispering jokes to each other to ease the tension in each other's backs and trying to keep straight faces over the din. If only there was an example of a peaceful union between elves and humans that he could shove in their stupid, stubborn faces. No, Ezran had thought. No. He couldn't ask them to do that. That would be dumb. That would be ridiculous. That would be honestly not that different from what they are doing already. He rolls up his letter, rests his quill in its ink pot, and stares at his father's, at his seal, for the longest time before he drips red wax on the edge of the parchment. He and Callum were both young when they came to understand that they, as the royal family of Catullus, would never have the luxury of marrying for love, that their eventual marriages would most likely be arranged to form convenient alliances, but, if Ezran plays his cards right, he might just find a way to make sure his brother gets both. The letter finds Callum in Neolandia while he and Rayla are sitting in the courtyard with a couple of curious kids. They've never seen an elf before, and Callum can't help the little smile that tugs at his features as Rayla lets them examine her hands and her horns and her ears. She's all smiles and giggles as the little girl braids her hair, and as her toddler of a brother sits happily in her lap and counts her fingers, and he thinks, later, if he's got the time, he might draw it. Their meeting isn't until tomorrow, and he imagines it'll be full of yelling and arguing as always, so he's reluctant to disturb her now, while she's content and relaxed. He thanks the messenger quietly and grins at the seal. He and Ezran try to keep each other posted as best they can, but it's hard when Ezran is a king and he's an ambassador. Usually, he can expect a letter once every couple of months, and they'd just been to see him a few weeks ago for that negotiation about mining options, so this is a pleasant surprise. He skims over Ezran's untidy scrawl, chuckling a little at the splodge of ink at the bottom that's supposed to be Bates' signature, and feels his brow furrow as he backtracks and reads the final line again. I need a favor from you guys. Can you come back to Catullus after your thing in Neolandia? It's important. You're making a face. He glances up to find Rayla watching him over her shoulder. She tucks her new braid behind her ear and shifts her weight a little, careful not to disturb the little boy playing with her fingers. Am I? She nods at the letter. Is everything okay with Ez? Oh, says Callum. He grins to reassure her. Ezran's like a brother to her now too, after all. He's fine, I think. He wants us to come back to Catullus after the treaty signing tomorrow. So soon, asks Rayla. Her face falls as a woman with the same blonde hair as the little girl at her side stamps towards them, looking like she can't decide if she's stern or nervous at the idea of her children playing with an elf. Rayla eases the little boy from her lap and points a finger at his mother. Time to go back to Mum now, little ones, she says. Bye. But we're still playing, whines the little girl, but Rayla chuckles and jerks her head at her mother. We'll play again when we visit next time, she promises. Go on now. Don't want Mum to be mad. The little girl sulks, but she takes her brother's hand and trudges back. Their mother lifts the boy to her chest and seizes the girl's wrist, casting a disapproving glance at Rayla as she goes, but Rayla shrugs it off and gets up. Callum's frowning after them when she takes a seat on the bench. That was rude. Well, they can't all be like you. She elbows him playfully. We can head straight back to Catullus after the signing, she adds. It's no problem. We need to head back to Zadia soon anyway. It's on the way. Yeah, says Callum. He's still frowning, but Rayla elbows him once more and prods his cheek. "It's not a big deal," she says. "I'm not offended. You shouldn't be on my behalf." She takes the letter from him and squints at Ezran's handwriting. "I wonder what could be so important that he wants us back so soon. You and me both." Callum shakes his head. "Guess we'll find out." Rayla makes a face at him. "Come off it, Callum," she says, patting his knee. "It's a nice day. We're going to see Ezran again in a couple of days. Don't let one thing get you down, hey?" "How do you deal with it?" he asks her. "Those kids have no problem with you, why should anyone else? You get much worse than me whenever we're in Zadia," she points out. "And you always tell me not to worry about it. I'm asking you to do the same thing now. It's nothing, don't let it get you down. Okay." She offers him a smile, and when he looks into her face, Callum finds his mood lightening little by little. It's been 3 years. She's grown a little, her hair is longer now, her cheeks, leaner, but her eyes and her smile are both the same. They put his mind at ease, and he squeezes her hand gently and allows the anger to leave his system in a rush. "You're right," he says at last. She laughs. "Aren't I always?" She is, he thinks. But he doesn't tell her that. Chapter 2. Summary. It's not that he thinks they'd react badly to his proposition. It's that he doesn't know how they might react at all. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. 2. They arrive in Catullus within the week. They've come and gone often enough that the guards at the city gates know her by face now. They bow to Callum, and while their jaws are set and their eyes are hard, they offer Rayla a stiff nod. She nods back. She's been greeted in worse ways, after all, so ultimately she can't complain. Before the gates swing open with a great creak and they are ushered into the market square. It hasn't changed much. Granted, the last time they were was only a few weeks ago, but that's beside the point. The city's still packed with people and carts and horses, with the occasional stray chicken running loose between the sea of legs. It's still loud and dirty, and every now and then, Rayla feels the back of her neck prickle with the stare of a curious stranger. She fights the urge to draw her hood up overhead. It's been a long while since the war ended, but the world, herself included, is still getting used to the idea of elves and humans mingling with each other so casually, and it's a learning curve for her just as much as it is for them. She still remembers the first time she arrived in this city as Ezran's guest, still remembers the confusion and the hostility that met her when she'd first walked through those gates. It's better now, but the attention still puts her on edge, and she finds herself subtly shifting closer to Callum as he leads her through the crowded market. He anticipates it, catches her fingers with his and pulls her along, edging between carts and people as the castle looms overhead. He squeezes gently as they pass by a baker who shoots her a dirty look, and Callum glares back, a stern reminder that he's not just an archmage, but also a prince, his prince, in fact. The baker ducks his gaze, and Rayla finds herself forcing down an impressed chuckle. "You'll scare everyone off like that, you know," she comments mildly. Callum snorts a little as he tugs her out of the crowd and into the comparatively empty street on the other side of the market. "It's rude to stare," he says. "It's worse to glare." It's supposed to be a joke, but Callum doesn't laugh. He doesn't even snigger, and too late, Rayla notices the tension in his shoulders and the tightness in his jaw. Perhaps if she were anyone else, she mightn't have noticed it at all, but she's known him long enough now to know when he's bothered and pretending not to be. She stops, pulls against his fingers, and draws him to her. "Hey." Callum sighs. It's little more than a huff through his nose, but still a sigh nevertheless. He sags his shoulders, and relaxes his jaw, and he offers Rayla a smile, a grimace, really. It's an odd tilt of his lips more than it is anything else, as he shifts the strap of his pack. "Sorry," he murmurs. "It's fine, okay," she says quietly. Her fingers are still laced with his, her thumb rubbing circles into the back of his hand like it'll ease the tension out of his system. "I'm not bothered by it, and you shouldn't be either." "I know." His voice is clipped, bitter, even. Rayla makes a face at him. Part of her wonders if this is cumulative, if he's still bothered about the woman in Neolandia and it's carrying over and adding to his discontent with the baker. It's not like him, she thinks, and it worries her a little. He's not one to dwell, not usually, and it's rare for him to be so stubborn over something they both agree is just dumb. In all fairness, she can't really scold him for it. She's decidedly less patient, and she imagines that, if they were in Zadia, she might have picked a fight over it already. But she takes her own turn to sigh, tries to breathe the frustration out for both of them, and brushes his bangs out of his eyes. Callum. He leans into her touch and takes in a breath. You're right, he murmurs, and when he finally does look at her, he smiles. A real one this time, one that reaches his eyes. Let's go see Ez. She grins back. Let's. Your Majesty. Ezran's in a lesson this morning. He may be king, but he's not foolish enough to think he can run the city without at least a base understanding in economic theory. Meetings and negotiations and treaties and court don't leave a lot of room for spare time, but Ezran does his best to fill in his gaps regardless. He'd be a poor king if he didn't have the knowledge to back up his decision-making, but he'd be lying if he said he didn't find it drier than the air in the breach. He'd only been half listening today, the other half of his attention focused on the two bluebirds flitting around each other on the windowsill. He jumps at the interruption, accidentally nudging a snoozing bait with the toe of his boot. His tutor, Anahita, frowns. What is it? Asks Ezran, swiveling around in his chair to face the messenger. The messenger bows deeply. My apologies, Your Majesty, he says. But Prince Callum and, he hesitates, pressing his lips shut uncertainly, the Lady Rayla have arrived. Suddenly he's wide awake. Ezran jumps out of the chair, stumbling over bait in the process. Sorry buddy, he mutters, heaving him into his arms. Are we done for the day? He adds to Anahita. Anahita sighs, puts her spectacles in her graying hair, and snaps her book shut. I don't imagine you'll be able to concentrate now anyway, she grumbles. Until next week then, Your Majesty. She bows her head, but Ezran hardly sees it. He pushes past the messenger, yelling a hurried apology over his shoulder, and all but sprints out of their makeshift classroom. Bait groans in his arms as he runs, as he nearly trips over his own boots on the way down the tower steps, and as he almost bowls over a chef and two guards in the hall. Please be careful, Your Majesty, he hears one say, and Ezran shouts a sorry. Will do, as he races past. He spots Callum and Rayla in the west wing of the castle, Callum with his pack slung casually over his shoulder, Rayla grinning fondly at a page in Callum's sketchbook. Hey, he calls. You're back. And Callum has barely a second to turn before Ezran rounds into them both and brings all three of them to the ground in a giggling heap. Sorry, he adds, untangling himself, while Bait groans and finds his way into Callum's lap, looking disgruntled. I missed you guys. We've only been gone a few weeks, chuckles Callum. What's so important that you wanted us back so soon? Later, says Ezran, waving him off. How have you been? Good, until you tackled us both into the ground, teases Rayla. She musses his hair, grinning as she struggles to her feet. She holds an arm out to Callum too and rubs Bait's forehead affectionately to say hi. I hope our arrival didn't interrupt anything. Nah, says Ezran. Just economics. Nothing too interesting. Callum snorts at him. I dunno, Ez, economics is important. I don't see either of you putting yourself through it. We're not the ones making all the big decisions. He grins, handing Bait off to Rayla entirely to sling an arm around Ezran's shoulders. Anyway, what's new? Anything cool going on? Anything we should know about before we get settled in? He doesn't mean anything by it, but Ezran almost has a heart attack there and then. He laughs it off, trying to keep the nerves out his smile. Ah, nah, nothing new to report, he says, looking away perhaps a little defensively. Just, you know, more of the same. It comes out too cheerful and too loud, and Callum and Rayla, who both know him far too well, raise their eyebrows at him, which does nothing to settle the panic in his stomach. It's not that he thinks they'd react badly to his proposition. It's that he doesn't know how they might react at all. It was funny that time he'd called Callum out on it, but this is different entirely. This means forcing them to examine their relationship in a way that they probably, knowing Callum, haven't yet, and, not only that, it puts them on show for literally the entire world to see. It's a daunting prospect, even to him, and he's not even really involved. He thinks he'd rather they be fed and well settled before he drops that bombshell on them. Is everything okay? Asks Rayla slowly. Yep, says Ezran. Yep. Let me help you guys with your stuff. X. When they come to visit, Rayla usually stays in Ezran's old room because of its proximity to Callum, but this time around, with his proposition in mind, Ezran had gone to the trouble of having a separate room prepared for her a little way down the hall. Whatever happens next, whatever they decide to do, he wants to minimize the impact it might have on their lives, and the last thing they need is the scandal of staying in the same room on top of, well, the scandal of an elf-human marriage. Having it in his head in so many words makes it feel so much heavier, and when Ezran had opened the door for Rayla to let her examine her new quarters, the why was obvious on her face long before it left her mouth. I thought you might like the privacy, Ezran had told her, voice squeaking in odd places. He'd thrown in a grin for good measure, but Rayla wasn't fooled then, and she's not fooled by the way he ignores his dessert now. Who does he think he's kidding? He'd do anything for a jelly tart, and the fact that he can't even touch them is more than enough tip off both her and Callum. All right, spill it, says Callum at last. He sets his goblet down with a decisive thunk that only makes Ezran's stomach squirm even more. You're not eating your jelly tarts, you put Rayla in a different room, what's going on, Ezran? You. He pauses, unsure how to put it in words that'll actually leave his mouth. He pushes his plate away, looks at the guard posted at the entrance of the dining hall, and clears his throat. Can we have a moment, he asks him. Alone. The guard hesitates. His eyes turn to Rayla, suspicious, apprehensive, and Ezran can practically feel the way resolve replaces the anxiety in his gut. Now. Of course, Your Majesty, he mumbles. He offers the three of them a clanking bow and leaves the room, but not without one last uneasy look at Rayla. It reminds Ezran of why he'd come up with this ridiculous idea in the first place, and he swallows, looks them both in the eye, and lets the words spill from his mouth in a rush. I want to arrange your marriage. He doesn't miss the shadow that crosses Rayla's face. She looks away. I'm not sure I should be at this meeting, she mutters crisply, pushing her plate away, but Ezran holds up a hand. To each other. The silence that follows is awkward. They stare at him, blinking, pale-faced, open-mouthed, wordless. Ezran hopes he hasn't broken them. Notes. Prompts filled. 1. Tumblr user at Burl sent me this headcanon about Rayla and Callum being unashamedly affectionate while also being in severe denial, and that is this entire fic, my dude. Chapter 3. Summary. The concepts that horrifying, is it? Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. 3. Come again, says Callum at last. It's not often that Ezran finds his brother's face unreadable, but it is today, and it sets him on edge. At most, it feels like Callum's scrambling for purchase on the concept but can't quite get a hold on it. Ezran presses his lips together, tries to tilt their corners into a wan smile like he isn't also a little terrified of the idea, but even that fails him. Rayla looks as if she still hasn't recovered, and twice, she tries to say something only for it to catch in her throat. He takes a breath. I think the three of us know better than anyone that elves and humans are both too stubborn to see that they are not all that different, he says, although his voice is weak and a little squeaky. I figured that us getting married would solve that problem. Callum slumps against the backrest of his dining chair and puts his hands over his face, as if the very idea is enough to give him a headache. Was that the favor you wanted from us when you sent us that letter? No offense, but that's a little ridiculous, manages Rayla at last. She still hasn't quite got a hold of her face, but Ezran notes the way she doesn't quite look at either of them. Yeah. I mean, us. He gestures wildly between himself and Rayla. We're not, there's nothing, where would you even get the idea? Ezran's hesitation around the topic disappears. He frowns at his brother. Where would I get the idea, he says, his tone dry, mocking. Are you serious? Yeah, snaps Callum. Where, exactly, would you get the idea that I'd want to marry Rayla? Rayla shuts her mouth at last as she rounds on Callum. The concept's that horrifying, is it, she says coolly. Callum falters. Well, He huffs. You said yourself that you thought it was ridiculous. It is, snaps Rayla. But not because I don't. She stops herself there, shuts her eyes tight and takes a steadying breath. Ezran catches something like grimace flickering across her face, but it's gone when she looks up again. We get enough stares and dirty looks without this, Ezran. It's not going to pan out the way you think it will. Won't it? Ezran raises an eyebrow at her, at both of them. Don't you get tired of the arguments at every negotiation? Don't you want a way to prove to that being friends isn't that hard? He pauses, choosing his words carefully. It's an opportunity, he says at last. It won't change things. It's just a legal thing to prove that friendship and unity between the Pentarchy and Xadia is more than possible, and you can still learn magic and travel and oversee treaties and stuff together. And, Callum, any marriage you were ever going to enter was always going to be political. At least this way, you don't have to marry someone you've never met. That's not how this works, says Callum. One arranged marriage isn't going to magically make everyone get along. Do you even realize what you're asking us to do? What, you think I didn't think this through? I don't know that you did. Rayla and I don't think of each other like that. You don't have to, snaps Ezran, it's an arranged marriage. In any case, who do you think you're kidding? Anyone with eyes can see what's going on there. What's that supposed to mean? That's enough. Rayla's voice is cutting, and whatever words Ezran might have said next die on his tongue. She gives them both a hard stare, her jaw set, her eyes unimpressed with a hint of something he can't quite place. A pause falls between them, heavy with implication, and, for a moment, Ezran thinks he might have misread the signs. Maybe he's wrong about this thing he thinks is between them, but he catches the look Rayla gives his brother and knows with a certainty that he can't explain that he's not. I get what you're trying to do, as she says levelly. Too levelly, like she's putting more effort into keeping her voice steady than she needs to. It's a nice sentiment, but it's still ridiculous. Ridiculous, yes, and he's well and truly aware of it, but Ezran takes careful note of the way she says ridiculous and not no. You don't have to agree to it, he tells them. To be totally fair, Rayla's not a citizen of Katolis and I can't ask her to do anything. But I want you both to be happy as much as I want what's best for the city and its relationship with Xadia, and I really think this is a good compromise. Please just think about it. For how long, exactly, asks Callum. Ez takes a breath. There's a ball in a couple of weeks. I was hoping to announce it then if you both agree. But he trails off, watching the way Rayla suddenly can't look Callum in the face and the way Callum seems to keep glancing at her from the corner of his eye. I won't force you to do anything you don't want to. It's your decision. He waits a full half-minute for them to rebut him, but when they say nothing else, he slips out of his seat and tucks Bait under his arm. Have a good night, you guys, he mutters, turning on his heel and leaving them both staring after him in the dining room. It is ridiculous, thinks Callum. The very idea heats his face and makes it hard to breathe, and he and Rayla are close, sure, but it's the result of spending years together in close quarters, not whatever on earth Ezran thinks it is. There might have been times when he's watched her surreptitiously out of the corner his eye, times when his hands lingered longer than they should, and hers left goosebumps in his skin, times when their banter bordered on flirting, even, but at the core of it, they are just friends. They are so comfortable together out of necessity, and even if there was an inkling of something more than platonic between them, and he's not saying that there is, because there's not, Callum would rather throw himself at a bantha without magic than risk their friendship for something as stupid as a crush. Which he doesn't have, just to be clear. The trek back up to their rooms is awkward. The tower staircase is narrow, but there's a space between them that was never there before, where they might have been bumping elbows and making jokes once. There's empty air and Callum can't help but blame Ezran for it. He loves his brother, but it was out of line to imply there was something more to their relationship when there's, clearly, not. Sorry about Ezran, he mutters at last. He doesn't look at her, he doesn't know that he can yet, without being reminded of idea of being married to her. He doesn't need his face any redder than it already is. He means well, says Rayla. She doesn't look at him either. I get it, I do, but... Callum lets out a tense laugh. I know, right? Us. Married. Can you even imagine? Yes, snorts Rayla, but she still doesn't look at him. She looks everywhere but him, in fact. It's pretty out there, all right. Right. And even if we did like each other like that, which we don't, it won't fix the problem. Not the way that he thinks it will. Probably not, she says, nodding uncomfortably as they step onto the landing of their floor. She offers him a weak smile that doesn't get all the way to her eyes, and when she accidentally meets his gaze, she looks away too quickly. Callum backtracks, wonders if he might have said something stupid, or if maybe he'd made a mistake. Hey, he says. He catches her hand as she gets to her door, and she flinches, her breath hitching in her throat as she snatches it back like his touch burns against her skin. Callum hesitates, but he doesn't move any closer. Are you okay? Fine, she says quickly. Yeah, it's just been a long day. Everything's fine. She's still not looking at him, and she's backed up against her bedroom door like his presence makes her uncomfortable. Alarm bells go off in Callum's head. They've never had this problem, she's never been uncomfortable around him, there's never been a reason for her to be uncomfortable around him, and he'd made sure of it. Rayla, he starts. Did I say something wrong? Nope, she says quickly, opening the door behind her like she wants to bolt. Not at all. Everything's dandy. Hey, whatever I said, I'm sorry. Nothing to be sorry for, she says. We're just friends, right? He pauses. The answer lodges itself in his throat, and he hesitates, an odd feeling he can't quite name bubbling in his chest. Yeah, he says finally. What else would we be? Rayla smiles at him, that same weak smile from before, devoid of her usual warmth and charm. Sleep tight, Callum, she bids him, slipping into her room and shutting the door in his face, leaving him wordless and alone in the hall. It's not a dumb plan, Ezran mutters, more to himself than to Bate, who's lying belly up on the bed. They care about each other more than they want to admit, I know it. Bate grumbles disapprovingly by way of answer. I know, groans Ezran. He paces the room, alternating between wringing his hands in front of him and running them through his hair in his frustration. I shouldn't have sprung it on them. But how? I don't understand how they've spent so long in each other's company and not noticed. Bate gives him a look. I'm not wrong, he snaps. I know them both too well. I saw it Rayla's face when I first told them. I saw it Callum's that day they were sparring in the courtyard. There's something there, they just don't know it yet, or maybe they do but they don't know how to admit it. I know I'm right about this, Bate. Because if I wasn't, don't give me that look, if I wasn't, this wouldn't be such a big deal. Callum was always going to have to marry for the realm, and he's known that for ages, and he picks now to complain about not having feelings when I suggest just marrying Rayla. He huffs, flopping face forward into the bed. Bate waddles over and plops himself next to him, nudging his hand for affection. They're the ones being dumb, mumbles Ezran into the bed, lifting his hand absently to rub Bate's belly. I just have to make them see it. Notes. You guys ever get second-hand embarrassment so bad you have to pause whatever it is you're doing and just take a second to breathe? Yeah. It's even worse when you have to write it. Chapter 4. Summary. She's not upset, she reminds herself. It's fine. She's fine. They're both fine. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. 4. Rayla's not upset. She's not. She's tired, yeah, and a little exasperated because Ezran's proposition is, well, ridiculous, but she's not upset, and she's furious at herself for even considering the idea that she might be. They're just friends. They've always just been friends. There's no reason to be disappointed, or sad, or even mad at Callum for reiterating the fact. They're affectionate because they are close, and have been for years, but there's never been anything more than that, no feelings attached but platonic ones, no intended intimacy over their casual familiarity. They're just friends. Or, at least, that's what she tells herself as she presses her back against the bedroom door. She hears Callum pause outside it, wonders if perhaps he'll knock and they'll talk it over and clear the air between them the way they always have when they've had arguments, but he doesn't, and his footsteps start against the stone floor and fade as he heads down the hall. Rayla breathes out a sigh. It comes out uneven and shaking for reasons she doesn't really want to admit. Her friendship with Callum is solid. It's been her anchor for the last 3 years and kept her grounded on days she's wanted to fly off the handle. It's constant and precious and comfortable, and when she'd first found herself wondering if maybe something else might come out of it, she'd squashed those feelings in the hope that they would go away and nothing would change. They haven't gone away. And now things are changing. His touch burns now, his hands suddenly foreign against her skin. His closeness to her out in the hall had made it hard to breathe. But she's not upset, she reminds herself. It's fine. She's fine. They're both fine. It's not like she wants to be married to him anyway, and even besides that, the idea of a marriage between an elf and a human prince is a whole other can of worms that she's not sure she even wants to touch. She has enough trouble with her own people sometimes, other elves who haven't quite accepted the reality of the war being over, who think she's thrown her lot in with humans. To be perfectly honest, she'd rather avoid the scandal and the gossip altogether. In any case, now she knows. They're just friends and she can squash those feelings for good, knowing they won't be reciprocated. She pushes herself off the door at last. Her new room is spacious and far bigger than she needs. There's a bed pressed against the left wall, a desk under the window, an armoire on the far wall that she has no need for, but the privacy is nice. Maybe Ezran had anticipated this reaction and had gone to so much trouble to make sure she had some space to clear her head. She flops into the bed and exhales tiredly into the sheets. She's not upset, she reminds herself once more. She imagines she'll feel better in the morning. Your Majesty. Ezran makes a face as General Balan, head of the Katolan army, follows him out of the throne room with heavy, clanking steps. Today's council meeting was early, and productive as it was, Ezran's still yawning into his elbow and trying to shake the sleep out of his system. He watches Balan's shadow on the corridor wall and waits until he can feel his presence behind him before he addresses him. "What can I do for you, General Balan?" Ezran asks, without turning around. "Forgive me, Your Majesty," he begins. Ezran can already hear the displeasure in his voice. "But there have been some rumors." "Rumors of what?" Balan draws a breath. "That your brother is to marry the elf." Ezran pauses in mid-step, eyes widening a fraction as he shoots Balan a look from the corner of his eye. How would Balan even know? He wonders. He'd gone to so much trouble to keep things quiet, to make sure he could keep Callum and Rayla out of everyone's attention until they absolutely needed to be. This doesn't need to be any harder for them than it already is, and word getting around so quickly makes him nervous on their behalf. He spins on his heel. "That my brother is to marry who?" he says sharply. Balan falters. Years of being on the High Council instead of the field have turned him into a greying and portly old man with a permanent skull. He might have been imposing once, Ezran thinks, with his perfectly polished armor and severe expression, but since Ezran's been on the throne, Balan's been more of a nuisance than a help. "My apologies, Your Majesty," he mutters quickly, throwing in a bow for good measure. There are rumors that your brother is to marry the Lady Rayla." Ezran finds himself smirking a little at the title. It's an unofficial thing, Rayla hates it, but she's too close to him and Callum for the rest of his staff to address her without formality. It's certainly better than hearing his staff refer to her as the elf, anyway. He forces himself to keep a straight face. "I don't know where you heard that," he says coolly, carefully, determined to keep Callum and Rayla's privacy for as long as he can. "As far as I'm aware, those are just rumors." "Your Majesty," Balan takes in a slow breath, like he's trying to keep his calm. "Prince Callum is too close to her ladyship. I believe that if we do nothing, those rumors will be encouraged." "Don't encourage them then," sneers Ezran. Balan's never been one of his favorite council members because of his obvious dislike for elves. Ezran gets it. Really, he does. Balan's been sending troops to the breach to fight Zadian forces for most of his life, and he understands his hesitation to drop his guard, but Balan is also one of the reasons it's still so hard to negotiate. The war's been over 3 years and his beliefs are outdated. Nowadays, Ezran doesn't have a lot of patience for his old world views. Balan presses his lips into a thin line. Ezran gets the feeling he's not Balan's favorite king either. "Your Majesty," he tries again. Do you really think it's appropriate for Prince Callum to be behaving the way he is? Prince Callum can do what he likes, says Ezran. And whether or not he's going to marry anyone is none of your business until he allows it to be by announcing his intentions. Has he announced his intentions? No, Your Majesty, but... Then it's none of your business. Ezran offers him a cold smile. I have other meetings to attend, General. Is there anything else? Balin sighs. No, Your Majesty, he says stiffly. That's all. He bows once more and takes his leave, armor glinting in the weak morning sun as strides down the hall. Ezran watches him go with a scowl. As much of a nuisance as he is, Balin's never done anything outwardly antagonistic, and there's no real reason to replace him with someone whose views are less bigoted. Not yet, anyway. He huffs, rounds the corner, and yelps when he finds Rayla leaning casually against the corridor wall. Bossy, she says, smirking. Queen Anya of Duran rubbing off on you, is she? Ezran laughs. You kind of have to be bossy to deal with people like General Balin. And you really think me and Callum getting married is going to fix people like him overnight? It won't, says Ezran. But it might be a start. He studies her face, notes the slightest of slumps in her posture and the tiniest hint of uneasiness in her eyes. Most of all, he notes the fact that she's not with Callum. He smiles at her. I've got some time before my next thing. Let's go for a walk. They end up in the stables. The horses have fun stories, Ezran tells her, handing her a horse brush and filling a bucket with straw and carrots for the splotchy brown filly in the last stall. It's nice to come down sometimes. The stable hands do a great job, but I think the horses prefer me because they can tell me what they want. This is Vorobei. The filly shakes her mane, and Rayla doesn't need to understand her explicitly to know she's pleased to see Ezran. Not for the first time, Rayla remembers how lonely it must be for him, she and his brother probably miles away on any given day with only bait and the horses for company. Vorobei, she asks. It's what she calls herself, says Ezran. The stable hands call her Nida, but she doesn't like it as much. The filly sniffs Rayla curiously, nosing at her hair and her ears. The coarse hair of her snout tickles against Rayla's neck, and she laughs, lifting a hand to rub her mane. She likes you, says Ezran, pleased. You can take her when you go, I think she'd like traveling more with you than sitting around here. He pauses, offering Vorobei a carrot from his bucket. I'm sorry about last night, he adds. I shouldn't have sprung it on you guys like that. It was a little sudden. It's fine, says Rayla, smiling a little as she brushes the tangles out of Vorobei's mane. It's not really news you could have given us warning for. Still. Ezran puts a carrot in her hand for Vorobei. You and Callum get along so well. I just don't get why it's hard for everyone else to see how easy it is. Believe me, mutters Rayla. We know. It's annoying for us too, you know, having to listen to elves and humans arguing over things that don't matter. I understand why you think it might help, I just don't know that it actually will. So, you won't do it. You asked us to consider it over the next couple of weeks, says Rayla. That's what we'll do. And Callum. What about him? Ezran pauses. Rayla can practically feel the way he tries to study her face, but she keeps her eyes on Vorobei, enjoying the way she snuffs the food out of her palm with eager lips. Did Callum upset you? I'm not upset, says Rayla quickly. Too quickly, and she curses herself for it. Ezran's a smart kid. She's probably just blown whatever chance she had at keeping her feelings to herself. He says nothing about it though. Instead, he offers Vorobei the bucket of straw and giggles at the way she helps herself to it. Give him time, says Ezran vaguely. He's not the most perceptive. He'll get there. What's that supposed to mean? Whatever you want it to mean, says Ezran. He pats Vorobei's neck and offers her a grin. You wanna take her out for a ride? She hears the stable door swing open before she can think about it, but it's the familiar footfalls against the hay-strewn floor that throw her into a panic. Rayla. You guys in here? Rayla blanches, and, unconsciously, she shrinks back against Vorobei. Ezran catches her eye, and she considers it, considers facing Callum and dealing with the annoying little ache in her chest at last, but in the end, she shakes her head. Ezran nods. He puts a saddle against Vorobei's back, straps it tight without a word, and points a finger at the back of the stable. Go that way, he murmurs. I'll distract him. He pats Vorobei's mane once more as Rayla mounts up before he pushes open the stall door. Hey, she hears him say. What's going on? Is Rayla with you? Asks Callum. I haven't seen her all morning. Nah, says Ezran. Have you tried the North Tower? She likes it up there sometimes. Come on, I'll help you look for her. Their footsteps recede, and Rayla heaves a sigh, grateful for Ezran's consideration, and for silence in the stable once more. Notes. Did I hear someone say they wanted some pining, Rayla? Chapter 5. Summary. It's not like he can do much more than think, anyway. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. V. As much as Callum would like to think that the palace staff have grown used to Rayla over the last 3 years, the sad reality is that they haven't, and while she doesn't need it, he accompanies her to breakfasts and dinners and anywhere else the staring and the glaring might make her the slightest bit uncomfortable anyway, the same way she does whenever they're in Xadia. They've grown protective of each other over the years, probably because their first journey together involved both sides trying to kill them at any one time, but their need to keep each other safe and okay in every sense of the word persists even now. To everyone else, it must look like they are joined at the hip, and perhaps that's where Ezran had gotten the crazy idea that they were more than just friends, but ultimately, Callum would rather deal with the rumors than know Rayla was in any way uncomfortable. So when she's not in her room the next morning, and she's not at breakfast either, the alarm bells that had started ringing in Callum's mind last night become a fanfare, because the only person who could make her so uncomfortable she'd avoid him is, well, himself. The guilt gnaws at him. He's still not entirely sure what he did, or what he said, but the guilt is there regardless, chewing at him from the inside until he's fretting around the halls asking if anyone's seen her, or, at the very least, the only other person in this castle she'd be comfortable going to, Ezran. They were on their way to the stables, Your Highness, a guard posted in the south wing tells him. His Majesty wanted to. She frowns like she's unsure that she'd heard correctly, introduce her ladyship to a horse. Of course. Callum almost laughs. Where else would Ezran take her? How long ago was that? Only a few minutes ago, Your Highness. Callum breathes out a sigh of relief. Thanks, he adds to the guard, before he jogs out of the keep, across the courtyard, and down the steps to the stables by the postern gate. He calls, pushing open the stable door, his footsteps against thumping heavily on the wooden floor. Rayla. You guys in here? He's answered by silence at first, broken only by the sound of braying horses in the stalls, before Ezran appears with a bucket swinging on his arm. Hey, he says. What's going on? Callum frowns at him. The guard had said they were both down here. Is Rayla with you? I haven't seen her all morning. Ezran shakes his head. Nah, he says, setting the bucket on the bench by the door. Have you tried the North Tower? She likes it up there sometimes. Come on, I'll help you look for her. He steers Callum out of the stable with a firm hand on his elbow, and they get all the way back to the inner bailey wall before Callum has the sense to shake him off. You haven't seen her, then? It comes out a little more suspicious of Ezran than he would have liked, but Ezran only shrugs. I would have thought she was with you, he says pointedly. Did something happen? Callum pauses, and whatever accusations he might have had for his brother leave him as the guilt comes back in full force. He ducks his head. I think I might have messed up. Ezran raises an eyebrow at him. What'd you do? I don't know, he says honestly. She didn't seem mad or anything, but I think I might have said something to upset her. I wanted to talk her about it and apologize, but... Yeah. Callum huffs and runs a hand through his hair. He waits until a stable boy passes them by completely before he shakes his head at Ezran. This whole marriage thing is messing us up, as he mutters, keeping his voice low. You think it has something to do with that? Maybe. Callum grimaces. I don't know. I just know we've never had problems like this. I don't know what to do to fix it. Ezran studies him, brow furrowing, lips pursed in a thoughtful frown. "I'm sorry I sprung it on you both," he says slowly, eyeing the guards posted at the inner bailey gates. "Whatever it is she's bothered about, whatever you think you did, it'll pass. She'll come back, and you guys'll talk it over the way you always do, and it'll all be fine again, you'll see." "Easy for you to say," mutters Callum. He looks up at the North Tower and sighs once more. Ezran's encouragement hardly feels like it, while he's right, and Callum knows in his head that he is. The problem feels even bigger now. He'd liked where he and Rayla were at before, and there's a very real possibility that this marriage thing might have put a rod through the spokes of that wagon wheel for good. In some ways, he feels like he should be mad at Ezran for messing it all up, but it's not Ezran's fault, and Ezran isn't the one who upset her. "You're sure you haven't seen her?" Ezran pauses, eyes flitting uneasily to the stables and back again. "Yeah," he says at last. Callum's stomach churns. He knows his brother too well to miss the lie, which can only mean that he has seen her, that she was in the stables with him, and might still be, and that she's so shaken up by whatever it was he did that Ezran's helping her keep away. He considers going back to corner her while he can, but he thinks about the way she'd shied away from him last night and decides she's probably had enough of him for now. "I can take it from here," he murmurs at last. "If we do end up talking, it should probably be in private anyway." "Good luck," says Ezran, patting Callum's back in a way that Callum guesses is supposed to be supportive. Callum snorts. "Thanks," he says. "I might need it." He goes up to the North Tower anyway. It's a thing Rayla does when the pointless arguments and the dirty looks start to irritate her. More than once, he's found her hiding away in the embrasures of the highest tower of whatever castle they are staying in, feet dangling dangerously off the edge of the parapet, braving the chilly wind that comes with the altitude just for some peace and quiet. Personally, Callum doesn't enjoy the height the way she does, but it's as good a place to wait for her as any, and if it works for her, there's no reason it shouldn't also work for him. It's not like he can do much more than think, anyway. He shivers in the wind, pulls his jacket tighter around his body and his scarf over his nose, and when that does nothing to warm him, he draws a rune in the air with both hands, breathes into it, and whispers, "Venchum obstructio." The wind dies immediately, blocked by an invisible wall extending around the tower, powered by his own breath. The relative silence is wonderful. Callum breathes it in and sits with his back against a melong, enjoying the peace, the quiet, the proximity to the sky. Until the trapdoor in the center of the tower opens with a bang and he nearly jumps out of his skin. "Callum. Ezran said you were back." Callum hardly registers who it is before the newcomer throws their arms around him in a rush. The dark hair is in a bun and the clothes, considerably less fine than he remembers, but the voice is the same, and Callum blinks against a shoulder and allows a chuckle to escape him. "Claudia." "Sorry," she says, pulling away to grin at him. "How are you?" "Where's, Rayla?" Callum laughs. "You don't have to call her her ladyship or whatever. She hates it." "She's," he makes a face and wonders how to explain. "It's complicated." Claudia tilts her head curiously at him. "Is this about the whole arranged marriage thing?" Callum stares. "How do you know about that?" "There have been some rumors." Claudia giggles and tucks a stray lock of her hair behind her ear. "No one really knows anything more about it than that. It'd be fitting, I think, if you two went through with it. I know you care about each other a lot." Callum winces and stares at his shoes. That's a little complicated right now. Can we just not?" He shakes his head. "What are you doing here anyway? I thought you were trying to find a way to help Soren without, you know." Claudia studies him, but in the end she just shrugs. "Ezran, sorry, His Majesty lets me use the library from time to time. There are some good texts in there. And Soren's doing really well, actually. We found, well, it's hard to explain. I think it's better just to show you." "Show me?" Claudia nods, grinning. "Have you got time now?" "I guess." Her grin widens. "Come on." She takes him to an apothecary at the edge of the city. The sign is newish compared to the signs of the other shops around it. Callum thinks it can't be any older than a couple of years old, but the wares inside are fascinating, and unlike products he'd find in other apothecaries within the Pentarchy. There are buckets of moonbreeze by the window, bunches of Zadian sweetgrass for sale, vials of shimmering medicine on the shelves, odd little trinkets imbued with sun magic. Callum frowns, wondering where anyone would get all of this when human travel in Zadia, even for trade, is still so restricted. "Alis," calls Claudia. "There's someone here you should meet." There's a rummaging in the back room. Alis is an odd name, Callum thinks, but only until the back curtain rustles and someone tall with dark skin, gold marks under his eyes, and slanted horns strides into the room. The vials of medicine. The Zadian sweetgrass. Alis. Of course. Everything makes sense now, and Callum lets out a long "oh" as realization dawns on him. "Alis, this is Archmage and His Royal Highness, Prince Callum," says Claudia, ushering him forward. "Callum, this is Alis. He's been teaching me some stuff." "Oh, nice to meet you," Alis says Callum, a little stupidly, but pleased all the same. Alis offers him a smile and a small bow of his head. He reminds Callum a little of Rayla's uncle with his kind, patient eyes, and the way his grin is just a little lopsided. "Your Highness," he greets. "Claudia's told us about your adventures. You've been doing good work." Thank you," says Callum. I didn't realize, trade deals have been so hard to negotiate." "I'm aware," says Alis, with an amused twinkle in his eye. "But as I said, you've been doing good work. It's because of you and the young elf Rayla that I've been able to set up here. And by extension, it's because of you Soren's okay," says Claudia, clapping her hands in front of her. "I know you guys are trying to set up ways for humans to go and learn magic in Zadia, but there's no way someone like me, with my background in dark magic, would ever be able to go. So, Alis has been teaching me instead. Just, little bits. Enough to make sure Soren can walk." "Where is he, anyway?" asks Callum. "Out with Lesser," says Alis. "My daughter," he adds. "She rather looks up to Rayla. She'd be thrilled to know you were here today." "Maybe I'll bring Rayla by sometime then," chuckles Callum, forgetting, for an instant, the business with their supposed marriage. Saying her name reminds him though, and when he remembers the rest of his problems too. He huffs and stares down at his shoes. It was nice to meet you, Alis, but I really should be getting back." "Stay for lunch," insists Claudia, grasping one of his hands in both of hers before he can move. "It's been a long time and Alis' wife is an amazing cook. And you'll get to see Soren. Come on, Callum. Please." Callum pauses. Catching up does sound nice, and there's not a lot for him to do in the castle but sit and wait and think. The distraction might be good for him. "Sure," he says at last. "Lunch sounds great." Claudia cheers and throws her arms around him again. He doesn't see Rayla crossing the story front window, eyes downcast, heartbroken grimace on her lips. Notes. This was supposed to be a romcom but my kids are just so sad RN, sorry everyone. Chapter 6. Summary. As I said, Your Highness, any start's a good start. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. 6. The Wishbone is a little a shop on the edge of the city, Rayla overhears. It's only been around a couple of years but it's popular amongst the common folk for its mysterious and magical goods. No one really knows where the owner gets his merchandise, but no one complains either. Nowhere else sells Zadian fruit and strange trinkets and quick cures for things like headaches and hangovers, let alone for such reasonable prices. The woman she overhears it from even says it's run by an elf. Curious, Rayla steers Vorobay through the streets, her hooves clip-clopping gently against the cobblestones as she eases her way through the crowd. She's not sure what to expect from it, but the idea of a little piece of Zadia, a little piece of home, here in Katolis feels like it might be comforting, especially right now, while her thing with Callum is such a mess, and she feels more alone than ever. She doesn't expect for Callum to beat her there. She doubly doesn't expect him to be there with Claudia. She's not jealous, she tells herself, although, in all fairness, she's been convincing herself that she's not a lot of things lately. At least this time she can actually be honest about it. She can't be jealous of losing Callum to Claudia if Callum was never hers to begin with. There's a part of her that wants to be rational, that wants to believe that there might be nothing to be worried about. Callum's been just as affectionate to her over the years, more so, even, but they are just friends, and those words had come from him. This is different, though. There are pre-existing emotions there, emotions that Callum might still have, that Claudia might return. Rayla had always wondered what happened to that crush. Recent events kind of imply that he might still have it, even after all this time, even after Claudia had tried to kill them, back in the day. In any case, it's none of her business, and she draws her hood over her head, forgetting what had brought her to the story front of the wishbone to begin with, and tugging Vorobei along by her reins without a word. The filly snorts, nosing gently at Rayla's ears. "Don't worry yourself over me, Vorobei," Rayla chuckles, patting her snout over her shoulder. "Let's go back up to the castle, hey? I think we're done here for the day." Aelus and his family live above the shop. The staircase up to their little apartment is narrow, and when they emerge on the landing, Callum spots a couple of shelves crammed with books and tools and trinkets from both Zadia and the human kingdoms, a workshop desk lit by a sustone lamp, and odd pieces of Catolan armor hanging haphazardly off door handles and the backs of chairs. He frowns at those in particular, before a woman with a swell in her belly rounds the corner with a pot of stew in her arms and frowns back. "Your Highness," she says. She shoves the pot on the nearest flat surface and bows awkwardly. It takes Callum a second, but recognition lights his features as he studies her face. He's seen her grey eyes and red hair a couple of times at the castle, but never outside of her armor, and never so comfortable. He feels terrible he doesn't even have a name. "You're part of Ezran's crown guard." A smile quirks her lips. "Not at the moment, Your Highness," she says, patting her belly. "My apologies. I should have known better. It was only a matter of time before you heard of my husband's store and came to see it for yourself." "Your husband?" Aelus squeezes past and presses a fond kiss against the woman's temple. "My wife, Eleni," he says to Callum. "Isn't she wonderful?" "You guys are gross," laughs Claudia. "Soren and Lesser won't be too far off." "Can I help with anything, Eleni?" She takes the pot from Eleni without waiting for an answer, and Callum watches as she and Aelus bustle around her, taking over her chores, fluffing cushions for her back, and doting on her unborn child. Callum finds himself feeling like an outsider, intruding on something private and familiar. This life is simple, he thinks, easy, and everything elf-human relations should be, everything he imagines the world could be if elves and humans stopped fighting for just 1 second. Claudia talks to him over the chores. She and Soren have a place a little while from here, but she helps Aelus with his shop and with Lesser because he helps her keep Soren walking. They are good friends. Aelus is the one person who's never judged her for the magic her father taught her to do, the one person who'd not only helped Soren back on his feet, but taught her how to help him herself. In return, they run his shop when he goes to visit Zadia for supplies, look after Lesser when Eleni has to work, and keep the narrow-minded away when they pass by looking distrustful and wary. "It's much easier now than it was," Eleni tells him, propping her feet up against the cushions. "We have you and her ladyship to thank for that." "I mean, you're welcome," says Callum, "but what are we doing exactly?" Eleni purses her lips thoughtfully. "I think people just need to see that it's possible," she says after a moment. "Aelus and I never thought it was, but here we are." He was a healer, back in the day. He'd come from Zadia offering help to anyone who needed it, elves and humans alike. That's what I liked about him, you see. If only everyone else were like him. She winks and blows a kiss at him from over the back of her chair. "Still gross," calls Claudia, but they ignore her. "I still don't understand," says Callum. "If it's as easy as showing it's possible, why is it still so hard to get through one negotiation?" "They can't all be like us," chuckles Eleni dryly. "But any start's a good start." "This feels pointed." "Does it?" Eleni laughs. "The guards know everything, Your Highness. You and her ladyship should be careful about where you hold your personal discussions." Callum has the sense to flush a little at that. Inwardly, he wonders what other personal discussions they've accidentally allowed the palace guards to be privy to. He shakes his head and considers denying it, pretending the rumors really are just rumors, but it feels safe here, and he doesn't want to lie to people as genuine and nice as Eleni and Aelus. "You really don't have to call Rayla that," he says instead. "I know," chuckles Eleni. "But it's to keep the other, not so open-minded folk from calling her anything less. As I said, Your Highness, any start's a good start." X. It's late afternoon when Rayla gets back to the stables. She'd dawdled a bit, had tried to distract herself with anything and everything only to feel worse when she'd realized that most of it reminded her of a joke or something that she might have told Callum. Catullus can feel lonely on a good day, but at least, on good days, she had him. Once, a little while ago when she'd started to miss home, he'd found her on the North Tower and sat with her until the sun set and the moon was high in the sky. She'd leant on his shoulder, careful not to prod him with her horns, had enjoyed his presence and his warmth and his touch without worrying about the implications they might hold now. She misses that. She misses their casual intimacy. She misses him, and while she's still not ready to face him, she can admit that much at the very least. I don't suppose there's any point in denying anything now, she murmurs to Vorobei as she unstraps her saddle. It's only been a day, you know. How stupid is that? Vorobei brays at her. I've no idea what you're saying, chuckles Rayla, but I appreciate it. She puts Vorobei's saddle away, unclasps her reins and rubs gently at the marks they'd left on her snout. Thanks for the company, she says, before she backs out of the stall entirely and walks almost headfirst into General Balin. My lady, he says, with a stiff bow. I wonder if we could have a word. Rayla raises an eyebrow at him, tension growing in her shoulders. His conversation with Ezran rings fresh in her mind. I suppose, she says, edging away from him carefully. What exactly can I do for you, General? With respect, my lady, he says. I ask you not to go through with this marriage. Rayla actually snorts at that. She weighs her options, wondering if honesty might be the more mature approach, but Balin has never struck her as the type of person she'd want to be honest for. That's not for you to ask, she says, unfriendly smirk playing on her lips. It is if it's in Prince Callum's best interests. Somehow, I don't think it was Prince Callum's interests you had in mind. Rayla rolls her eyes and pushes past him, eager to be done with this conversation. He stops her with a hand around her wrist. I ask you again, he says, his voice cold with an unspoken threat, his grip like iron. Don't go through with this marriage. You are hardly an appropriate choice, and a marriage to you would turn His Highness into a laughing stock. Rayla sculls, free hand drifting instinctively to the blades at her back. I don't know where you're getting your ideas, General, she sneers, tearing her wrist out of his grip. But you'll have to take whatever issues you might have up with Ezran. His Majesty doesn't understand, snaps Balin. He doesn't realize what Prince Callum's marriage to you would mean for Catullus. You know those are rumors, right? That shouldn't be encouraged by your continued behavior. You and Prince Callum both. He scowls at her and stamps against the stable floor. In her stall, Vorobei nickers a warning at him, bumping menacingly against the stall door. Balin falters. I ask you once more, he hisses, in a way that's not asking at all. Do not go through with this marriage. Open your eyes, Balin, snaps Rayla, fighting to keep her cool. There isn't one. Then I ask you to leave. What? He glares at her, furious, but afraid to make a move against her and the angry filly in the stall. Leave, he says again. Your kind don't belong here. They never have. They never will. Rayla actually laughs. It'll take a little more than you to convince me to do that, she hisses, and she means it. She's faced powerful archmages and dragons and armies with no one at her side but Callum. An old general hardly scares her. It's unbecoming to be a bigot, General Balin, she says. Time to grow up. She turns on her heel before he can stop her, leaving Balin, red and fuming, scowling after her in the afternoon sun. Notes. No Soren just yet, but he'll turn up, I promise. *** prompts filled. From an anon, Rayla tries living in the castle and faces racism and odd human customs. ***. Chapter 7. Summary. Don't be a chicken. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. 7. Soren turns up part-way through lunch with a little half-elf girl, Lesser, Callum presumes, slung over his shoulder and giggling into his back. He hasn't changed much. He walks with a cane now and his movements are a little slower, but it doesn't seem to bother him, and it certainly doesn't stop him from roughhousing with Lesser. His face splits into a cocky grin when he spots Callum at the table. Well, if it isn't the step prince, he greets happily, hoisting the little girl off his shoulder. Lesser, who's that? Do you know who that is? Lesser squeaks a little when she sees him, hiding her face in Soren's pant leg so that all Callum can see is Eleni's mop of red-brown hair and Ayla's golden eyes. She can't be much older than 3, and Callum offers her a kind smile as he climbs out of his chair to say hello. Hi, he says gently, crouching in front of her. She gives him a tiny curtsy, but keeps most of herself behind Soren. Your Highness, she mumbles. He hears the slightest hint of smile in her voice, and when he looks, he catches it twinkling bashfully in her eyes. She peers around the room like she's counting the people in it. Her face falls. Oh. She's looking for Rayla, chuckles Alis. Ah. Callum grimaces. He's pretty disappointed that she's not here too. It's been a good afternoon, but to be completely honest, all he's been thinking is about how much she would have loved to be here today. She'd like Alis and his family, and he imagines his shop might feel like a little piece of home while she's so far away from it. I'm sorry I'm not as cool as her, he says to Lesser after a moment. But hey, how about I bring her by sometime? Would that be okay? Lesser nods eagerly, face lighting up behind Soren's pant leg. She's not usually this shy, snorts Soren, mussing her hair. Normally she's running around like a crazy chicken. Isn't that right, Lesser? She giggles and shakes her head furiously, her timidness fading fast as Soren ushers her forward. Callum grins at her properly now, noting the 2 tiny horns peeping out of her hair, her rounded ears, and the 5 little fingers on each of her hands. I'm not a chicken, she pouts, clutching at Soren's fingers, still a little cautious of Callum. You're definitely not a chicken, agrees Callum. I think you're a little lady, just like Rayla. Her eyes go wide, something like a blush gracing her chubby tanned cheeks. She releases Soren's fingers at last and shuffles towards Callum with the edge of her thumb in her mouth, studying his eyes and his smile the way only a 3-year-old would, like she's trying to measure the amount she likes him. I'm a lady. Of course, says Callum, scribbling a rune in the space front of her and muttering, Flor em Cresco, under his breath. A daisy springs to life between them, and he plucks it from the air and presents it to her with a bow. For you, my lady. Soren scowls at him. Hey, back off, I'm the favorite uncle. But Lesser swells anyway, accepting the daisy with both hands and a smile almost too big for her face. She offers him a second, clumsier curtsy, and toddles past him. Mama, Prince Callum says I'm a lady. Aren't you just, laughs Eleni, scooping her little girl off the ground. You're very good with her, she adds to Callum. Callum waves her off as he gets up. Rayla's better, he says, grinning because he means it, and Lesser's presence in the room only makes him wish that she were here more. He's not above admitting that he thinks she'd be a great mom someday, and while he's still guilty about whatever it was that he'd done to upset her, but he hopes bringing her here might make up for it, even just a bit. She'd love Lesser as much he does already, he's sure of that at least. Her little fingers and her tiny horns make him wonder, inwardly, what his own child might look like, if he or she might inherit his eyes and Rayla's. He stops himself there. Forces the thought away. Keeps the heat from rising above his collar. Callum, he hears Claudia say. You kinda seized up there, you okay? Callum clears his throat. Fine, yeah, he says. Yep. Everything's fine. He stays longer than he intends, and when he does, finally, take his leave, Soren and Lesser go with him. Soren, because the exercise is good for his legs, and Lesser, because she has the energy of an excited 3-year-old and needs to wear herself out so her parents can have an easier time putting her to bed. You shouldn't be wandering the city by yourself anyway, Eleni had told him, frowning, even as she pressed a bottle of moonberry cider into his hands. You're the prince. Also an archmage, but you know. He'd laughed. Also I can't take this. It's not for you, Alis had snorted. It's for Rayla. Bring her by soon, won't you? I will, Callum had promised. Now they are here, the bottle of moonberry cider swinging from his left hand, Lesser swinging happily from his right as he and Soren make their way up the cobbled streets and towards the castle gates. Why stay all the way out here? Callum asks him to kill the silence. Ezran had to have offered, even after, you know. Soren shrugs. It just didn't feel right, you know. He pauses, shifting his grip on his cane as they swing lesser forward. When he speaks again, his voice is quiet, honest, more honest, even, than Callum had ever heard from him in their youth. I can't be on the Crown Guard like this, he says. I can't look after Ezran to make up for the things I did for my dad. It wouldn't be fair to take his offer to stay without paying any of it back. Then there was Claudia, and all she wanted was for me to be better, and we weren't going to find anything that would help up there, especially without dark magic. And then there was the whole thing with our dad and how we only lived there because of him anyway, and he was, you know, kinda crazy. He grins fondly at Lesser. This is better. Callum chuckles a little and finds that he has to agree. Soren's grown a lot since he last saw him, and he imagines that has a lot to do with the sudden loss of his mobility. The magical charm he wears on his belt is all that keeps him active now, and it's effective, sure, but it's not a permanent solution. Aelus has to help Claudia imbue it with magic every few weeks, and there's every possibility it might stop working for him tomorrow. It's a scary thought, even to Callum, and he promises silently to himself that he'll find a way to help, even if it's just getting Claudia more resources. Are you really gonna do it? Soren asks after a minute. Go through with the marriage thing. Rayla and I are just friends, says Callum quickly, ducking his head. Really? Really? Soren snorts at him. You know how it looks to everyone, right? Has anyone considered how it might look to us, snaps Callum. It comes out harsher than he means it to, and he relents. Everyone keeps telling us we're good together, and that we should do it, and that he swallows. And that we're in love with each other, but we've never talked about that. What if we're still trying to figure that out? What if I'm still trying to figure that out? Aren't you in love with her? Callum blanches. He's never been asked so succinctly. I don't know, he mutters, because he doesn't. Rayla is his best friend, a single constant in a world that's changing too quickly for itself to keep up, a default. The thought that had crossed his mind before, about what his future children might look like, the only reason they had her features was because he'd defaulted to her. If they do go through with this, if they do get married, even if it is just for political reasons, he doesn't want it to be because she's just his default. He wants it to because he loves her, and he wants to be sure that he does. He respects her too much for anything less. It's complicated, says Callum at last. Whatever people think is between us, maybe we'll get there one day, but we're not there yet. We need time. Soren actually laughs at him. That's what you're worried about, he snorts. Time. I mean, I get it, but take it from someone who knows how quickly it might run out, Callum. Talk to each other. Take a chance. Don't be a chicken. Between them, Lesser nods sagely. Don't be a chicken, she says as well. Be like Rayla. X. They leave him by the gates. Soren has to take a minute to rest, and Callum waits with him, wanting to make sure he'll get home okay before heading in for the night. You can just stay, you know, he offers. I can take Lesser home and let Claudia know you won't be able to make it back. Just for that, I'm not staying, grumbles Soren, stretching out his back carefully. I can deal with it. I just need a minute. It sucks to see him like this. They've known each other for years, and while he'd known in his head how badly Soren had been injured, it's worse seeing it in person. It's better than it was, Callum knows that, but it still sucks, and he feels a wave of guilt wash over him for not trying helping sooner. Soren's past was misguided, but he was, and still is, a friend, and while Callum knows a considerable amount of magic now, none of it is meant for healing something as severe as the damage to Soren's back. He straightens with a huff after a moment. I'm good, he declares finally. Say bye now, Lesser, it's time to go home. Lesser pouts at him, at them both. But we just got here. We just came to drop off, Callum, chuckles Soren, a little exasperated by her constant well of energy. Think of how mad your mom will be if we don't get home on time. You really want her to be mad? No, I guess not, she mumbles, but she keeps her eyes down like she wants to cry. Callum laughs. Hey, he says, crouching over for her. I'll bring Rayla by soon, okay? But you have to be promised to be good, and that means going home with your Uncle Soren. You promise? Cross my heart, says Callum. He produces another flower for her and tucks it in her ear. Until next time, my lady, he bids her with a bow. Lesser giggles despite herself, curtsies to him, and curls her tiny fingers around Soren's. By Prince Callum, she mumbles, waving. Don't be a stranger at Soren, clapping Callum's shoulder and hoisting Lesser off the ground entirely. See you. Callum grins at them both and waves as they head back down the street, his fingers tapping idly against the lid of the bottle of Moonbury cider under his arm. He waits until they round the corner and disappear out of sight before he turns at last. The castle looms over him, a physical reminder of his problems against the darkening sky, and he sucks in a breath. Don't be a chicken, he mutters to himself, crossing under the gate. He hopes Rayla's at least willing to talk. Notes. Projecting my own cluckiness into fic is a normal thing, right? It's not. Fight me. Hey Sponty, remember how you wanted Callum to accidentally picture his future kids? This one's going out to you. Chapter 8. Summary. We don't have to talk about it, he says quickly. I just want you to not be mad at me anymore. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. 8. It's a long night. Rayla's not at dinner, which doesn't surprise him. Her empty chair turns his stomach, and he spends most of the meal pushing food around on his plate. He hears Ezran talking at him, but Callum doesn't really take a lot of it in. Instead, he lets his mind wander, from Lesser and Soren, and whether or not they've made it home yet, to the Moonbury cider sitting on his desk and the impending talk he knows he and Rayla have to have. You're not even listening, are you? Callum blinks and slides his elbow off the table. What? Ezran rolls his eyes. Just go talk to her, he groans, slouching in his chair. Callum scowls at his brother, feels his shoulders tense defensively and his hackles rising for no other reason than the apprehension building in his bones. Well, I would, he snaps. But she's not exactly in the mood to talk to me, is she? So? You miss her, don't you? Ezran says it's like a fact. He sets his fork down and stares Callum in the face, an earnest frown forming over his brow. It's true, Callum realizes. He does miss her. Maybe he hadn't recognized the feeling, but he can't deny it. He looks down at his uneaten vegetables before he pushes his plate away entirely and runs a frustrated hand through his hair. She misses you, Ezran tells him. She won't admit it, but that's the problem with you too. You can't admit to anything. Oh, so you're an expert now? Callum drawls. Ezran makes a face at him, looking unimpressed. Apparently, he says, obviously disliking Callum's tone. You're both being dumb. Literally everyone else knows what's going on here. Well, I don't, snaps Callum. I spent my whole day today being told by other people how I feel about her when I don't even have a handle on it. I don't need it from you. You've done enough to jeopardize our friendship. It comes out angrier than he intends, but he does little to hide it. He's had enough, he thinks, of people telling him what he feels and what to do about it. He's had enough of the fact that Rayla won't even talk to him, and yeah, maybe he does miss her, her presence, and her touch, and maybe he had been wishing she'd been with him today, but that's not the same as being in love with her. That's something they can't be told. That's something they have to figure out on their own. Ezran says nothing for a while, but in the end, he sighs. I'm sorry, he murmurs. I know this is hard on you both. Callum relents. I just want things to go back to how they were, he mutters. And I'm scared that they won't. He pushes his chair back with a huff. I'm going to bed, he grumbles. Ezran doesn't stop him. He doesn't go to bed. He almost does. He trudges all the way up to their floor in the West Wing with every intention of shutting himself up in his room and sleeping off his frustration, but it leaves him in a rush when he passes by Rayla's door. He pauses, stands outside it for gods know how long, before his gut decides what to do before his brain even has the chance to catch up. He stalks down the hall, snatches the bottle of Moonbury cider off his desk, and returns to Rayla's door. In total honesty, he hadn't intended to this so soon, but he's afraid that if he doesn't face her now, all hope of getting back to where they were might be gone forever. He takes a breath and raps his knuckles against the wood. The silence in the hall is deafening. Too late, he realizes that she might not be in there at all and, even if she is, there's no guarantee that she's had enough time to herself to want to talk. He feels his resolve start to crumble as the seconds drag on, but, just as it fades completely, the door swings open and his breath leaves him. Rayla looks tired. More tired than he's ever seen her, and there's an uneasiness in her eyes that almost sends him back into a spiral of guilt. "Hi," he greets quietly. "Hey," she whispers. Gods, he'd missed her voice. Even in their current circumstances, it makes him smile. "Can we?" He purses his lips, a little unsure on how to make the words actually come out of his mouth. Everything's been so messed up. Can we just take the night off from all of that and just be friends again? Even if it's just for tonight." She hesitates, but the corners of her lips tilt upwards, just a little, and Callum has to hold in the sigh of relief. She nods at the bottle in his hands. "Is that supposed to be some sort of peace offering?" Well." He offers her sheepish smile. "It can be. But it was always meant for you." The tilt in her lips becomes a chuckle, and Rayla stands aside to open the door a little wider for him. "Will you share it with me?" Yes, he thinks, but he glances at the guards posted at the top of the staircase and hold his tongue, Eleni's words ringing through his head like a timely warning. "You and her ladyship should be careful about where you hold your personal discussions." "Not here," he murmurs, giving her the bottle completely. "Meet me up on the North Tower. I'm just going to get some stuff." She blinks at him, curious, but doesn't argue. It's cold up on the North Tower in the middle of the day. He can only imagine how much worse it'll be at night, so he takes 2 cushions from his room in one arm, slings a blanket over the other, and makes a run for the kitchens for a couple of glasses before he climbs all the way back up the tower steps. He dismisses the guards posted in stairwell as he goes. He doesn't want to be overheard tonight. Rayla's frowning at the bottle when he climbs out of the trapdoor in the center of the tower. "Where do you even get this?" she asks him. Callum tosses the cushions against the parapet and settles in with a groan. "There's a shop in the city called the Wishbone," he says. "Run by an elf called Aelus." Something like recognition crosses her face, but it's hard to tell in the darkness. When he really looks, he decides it looks more like curiosity. "Aelus." Callum nods, patting the cushion beside him and motioning for her to sit. She does, but not without some hesitation. She seems a little too careful not to touch him still, but she doesn't object when he throws the blanket over both their shoulders and takes the bottle from her to pour them both some cider. "I wish you'd been there," he says, sipping lightly from his glass. It's sweet, and the fizziness makes him grimace as it tears down his throat, but the alcohol fills him with a warmth that he welcomes against the bitter wind. Aelus and his family, they're great. You would have liked them. Lesser, especially. Been making friends, have you? Callum laughs, snuggling deeper into the blanket. He tells her about his day, about Aelus and Eleni and the merchandise in the Wishbone, about Claudia and Soren and how much better off they've been since the end of the war, about Lesser and his promise to bring her by soon. Rayla listens with a tiny, fascinated smile tugging at her lips. It's the first time since they arrived back in Catullus that everything's felt right, even if she is still marginally cautious of him and his touch. They get closer as the evening wears on, though. Mostly, it's unconscious, but there's a part of Callum that's missed her warmth, a part of him that actively seeks it after their second, third, fourth glasses of Moonbury cider. She doesn't stop him. The cider's probably the reason this feels so easy, even for her, and, if anything, he thinks that Ezran might have been right and that she's missed him too. They talk about everything, and about nothing, until the moon is high in the sky and their arms are flush together, the awkward space between them gone at long last. They are on their 5th glasses of cider when Rayla leans her cheek against his shoulder, comfortable, tired, and probably just as fuzzy as he's feeling now. Her hair shines silver in the moonlight, her eyes far away and luminous in the dark. Callum's breath hitches in his throat. He really had missed her, he realizes vaguely. More than he ever thought he would. A whole day without her had felt longer than he ever thought possible, and through the alcohol-induced haze, he decides he never wants to live through that again. "What happened?" he asks her at last, the words soft as they spill out of his mouth before he can stop them. "What'd I do to mess us up so much?" She shakes her head against his arm. "It doesn't matter," she murmurs, tugging her end of the blanket tighter over her shoulders. He waits for her to continue, but when she doesn't, he shifts his shoulder just a little so he can look at her better. I can't make sure I don't do it again if you don't tell me what I did, he points out, tucking a lock of hair behind her ear. She breathes out a quiet sigh and shuffles away. Callum regrets it immediately, and he backtracks, certain that he doesn't want to do this again. We don't have to talk about it, he says quickly. I just want you to not be mad at me anymore. I was never mad, mutters Rayla. This arranged marriage thing is just a lot to consider. Rayla, You said we didn't have to talk about, she says shortly. They lapse into silence. Callum feels it coming dangerously close to square one, and he panics, climbs out of the blanket, and scrambles to his feet. The world spins for a moment, and he realizes, for the first time, how much he's had to drink and how little he's had to eat. His face is flushed and he struggles to be steady for just a moment. I know how to make it better, he says, bending his arms and kicking his legs out even though he knows how much it'll make him look like an idiot. Rayla stares at him. What are you doing? Callum almost doesn't hear her over the tune playing in his head. The jerk face dance, he says, stumbling a little as he raises his arms over his head, bobbing up and down and counting the beats under his breath. Stop. Rayla lets out a laugh, a real one that starts as a giggle that turns into a snort that turns into raucous side-splitting laughter that has her burying her face in the blanket to muffle the noise. He almost does, because the job is done and because he knows how stupid he looks, but gods, he likes it when she laughs. Nope, he mutters, waving his arms and pumping his knees. Out of the corner of his eye, he sees Rayla get up too, and she grabs his shoulders to steady him as he comes almost too close to the edge of the parapet. You're going to get yourself killed, you big dummy, chuckles Rayla. You wouldn't let that happen though, would you? Callum grins at her, catching her waist while she's so close. He holds her to him until they are swaying on the spot in a lazy, tipsy waltz, forgetting, for an instant, the trouble between them and the implications of being so close. She's only taller by her horns now, which she argues counts, and he argues doesn't. Either way, she has to look up to look into his face, and Callum blinks, realizing how their noses are so close that he can see the last dregs of cider glistening on her lips. He swallows. Rayla, he whispers. I think. She stops him by pulling away. I think we should go to bed, she mumbles, the smile and the laughter suddenly gone from her eyes and replaced with something else he can't quite name. It's late. Callum's breath rushes out of him, his head clearing as he stares at her under the dim light of the waning moon. Yeah, he murmurs, disappointed. I suppose it is. Notes. I don't condone underage drinking, but 18 is the legal drinking age in Australia, which is where I live, and that's close enough for me. Prompts filled. From Tumblr user at PC the Unicorn, Callum doing the jerk face dance for Rayla in order to apologize for something he did wrong. From an anon on Tumblr, Callum and Rayla's first date, sort of. Chapter 9. Summary. Are you going to call me a liar, General? Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. 9. Callum walks her back to her room in silence. They don't talk about what happened on the tower. Rayla's almost afraid to bring it up because it means having to admit to the warmth that had bloomed in her chest when he'd held her so close. She's not an idiot. She'd spent long enough today pining over him to know exactly what this is, and when he'd pulled her to him, his hands on her waist, his eyes landing, for a split second, on her lips, she'd panicked and pulled away, unwilling to fool herself into the hope that there might be something else there. They're just friends, she reminds herself. His elbow bumps hers as he tries maneuver through the hall with his pillows and blankets bundled in a heap in his arms. His touch still burns, but it's not so bad now. Rayla thinks it might be the leftover alcohol, but hopes it might be acceptance of the fact that there's nothing more to their relationship. It's not so hard to be around him anymore, and perhaps that's a sign that their friendship is on its way to a full recovery, so she has that at the very least. She can get over whatever aches and pains she might have in her chest. She can't get over the idea of not being friends with him, and she'd rather let him go completely than risk that. They pause at her door. Callum shifts the bundle of Manchester under one arm. Are we okay? Despite herself, Rayla smiles. We're okay, she says quietly. She wants them to be anyway, and she'll do everything in her power to make sure that they are. He smiles too, relieved. It makes her heart thump loudly against her ribs. So. I'll see you in the morning. You will, she promises, touching his hand the way she hopes she always has been, and not in any way that might give her away. Good night. Good night, Rayla. He squeezes her fingers gently, offers her one last still sort of tipsy smile, and heads backwards down the hall. Rayla watches him go, waiting for him to disappear into his own room before she shuts her door at last. She presses her back against it, slides against the wood until she's sitting on the cold stone floor, and sighs into her hands. It's fine, she mutters to herself, willing it to be because it has to be. It's been fine for 2 years, there's no reason anything has to change now. It's fine. I can do this. It's fine. It's not, but it'll only hurt her if she lets it, and she refuses to let it. Callum's friendship is worth that. Callum is worth that. They go to breakfast together the next morning. Rayla likes to think she's grown used to the stares she gets around the castle, but there's something different today. They don't seem wary of her, they seem curious. Of what, she's not entirely sure. She ignores them for the most part, and it's easy with Callum beside her again. He chatters all the way down to the dining hall, makes silly jokes that make her laugh, and plans to visit Aelus and his family later this afternoon, this time, with her. He hardly notices the way the guards look at them, like they know something he and she don't. He's just happy they're okay again, and Rayla can't even blame him for it. Yesterday was hard. So hard, she'd made the decision to just deal with it, their relationship, whatever it is to him, whatever it means to her, because she'd rather this pain over the pain of doing that all over again. This is easy compared to wandering the castle grounds and braving those looks on her own, compared to convincing herself that everything's fine with no external assurance of it apart from Vorobei, who is a horse she can have only half a conversation with. This is much better, she thinks, as they nudge each other into the dining hall and take their usual seats across from each other and greet Ezran good morning the way they always have, the thought of their potential marriage almost entirely forgotten, at least until Ezran fixes her with a look, one eyebrow raised, chin resting on his knuckles, lips quirked in an almost smirk that asks her silently if they've finally figured themselves out. Rayla presses her lips together, offers him the tiniest shake of her head, sort of, not really, it's complicated, and turns back to her breakfast, staring a little too hard at the jar of jam in front of Callum before she has the sense to actually reach for it. So, says Ezran carefully, frowning between the two of them. Everything's back to normal. Yeah, says Callum, nodding eagerly. Yeah, everything's great. And if you don't need us here later, I was going to take Rayla to the Wishbone. You know about the Wishbone? Asks Ezran, excited. You guys are usually so busy when you're here, I'm so glad you found it on your own. Actually, Claudia took me, Callum tells him. I didn't realize she still visited so often. I mean, I knew she and Soren weren't staying in the castle anymore, so when she found me yesterday, it was a surprise. Ezran ducks his head. Sorry I didn't tell you, he mutters. I wasn't sure if, after all the stuff that happened, I wasn't sure if you wanted to know. No, it was good, says Callum. We caught up, hung out in the Wishbone for a while. It was a good afternoon. A little smile tugs at the corners of his mouth, and Rayla takes in a surreptitious breath and goes back to staring at the jam. It's fine, she thinks. This is fine. It's fine. Anyway, continues Callum. If it's okay with you, I wanted to take Rayla later. I think she'll like it. Course it's fine with me, says Ezran, shrugging. You guys can do whatever you like. It just sucks I can't go with you. He groans childishly and pouts into his juice. Being king sucks. Next time, chuckles Callum. He helps himself to the fruit in the middle of the table as the dining hall doors swing open and General Balin strides in, his jaw clenched shut, his eyes hard. Forgive me, Your Majesty, he says, bowing to Ezran, but this is unacceptable. The rumors are getting out of hand. This can't continue. Rayla can practically see the physical effort Ezran has to put into keeping his face straight. He rolls his eyes. What are you on about now, Balin? Balin jabs an armored finger at Rayla and skulls. It has come to my attention that her ladyship is already romantically involved with Prince Callum. He spits the title and glares, disgusted by the very idea. He's answered by silence at first, and maybe it's just because it's been such hard couple of days or just the emotional turmoil she's been dealing with, or maybe she just really dislikes Balin, but in the end Rayla laughs. Ezran raises an eyebrow at her, and Callum stares, unsure how to react, but Rayla's had enough, she thinks. The fact that the thought is still prompting this reaction after 3 years of hard work, the fact that Balin thinks it's any of his business to begin with, the fact that there isn't actually a romance there, no matter how much she wants there to be, it's hilarious to her in the most mirthless way imaginable. "Where do you get your ideas, General?" she asks, wiping a tear away from her eye. "Why, you, my lady," he snarls, storming towards her. "Did you not spend the night on the North Tower with His Highness last night? Did he not dismiss the guards posted there for your privacy? Are you trying to say he did all this and all you did was, what, talk? Do you think perhaps he dismissed them because this reaction might be worse if he hadn't?" snaps Rayla. She gets to her feet as he approaches, one hand her hip, the fingers on the other twitching towards the blades at her back. "Imagine what might have happened if they'd stayed," she drawls. "Imagine all the juicy details you and your little guards might have to gossip about." "You don't deny it." Rayla snorts. "What would be the point in that?" she snaps. "You'd only accuse me of being a liar and a who. That's enough." Callum's in front of her all of a sudden, his hand on Balin's breastplate to keep him from coming any closer. Rayla hadn't even noticed him get up. "I'm going to deny it," he seethes. "Are you going to call me a liar, General?" Balin falters. "We talked," Callum snaps. "That's all." Balin scowls at him. "This behavior is doing nothing for your reputation, Your Highness. It can't continue. You should see what this behavior's doing to yours." Callum gives him an unfriendly smirk and shoves him back. There's a threat in his voice, and Rayla is suddenly and violently reminded of what he's capable of as an archmage. "Is there anything else?" Balin fumes, his face red enough to match his cape, but he says nothing and turns on his heel. Rayla watches him go over Callum's shoulder, her heart pounding too quickly and too loudly in her ears. She pushes past him, her breath uneven, whatever plans they might have had for the day disappearing in her anger. Callum stops her with a hand on her wrist. His breath is heavy too, but his fingers are gentle. "Sorry about him," he mumbles. "Are you okay?" "Fine," snaps Rayla. "Fine, like everything else." "Bloody dandy." "He was out of line," Rayla says Ezran quietly. "I'll talk to him." "Because he listens to you, does he?" Callum's fingers squeeze around her wrist. "Rayla. Come on." Behind her, Ezran touches her elbow, and she relents. He's being the best king he can be, but she knows better than anyone that trying your hardest might not make a difference for the most stubborn. "Sorry," as she mumbles. "I shouldn't have snapped." "Don't worry about it," says Ezran with a smile. "You guys should go. Spend some time away from the castle. I'll take care of Balin." Callum blinks and shakes his head. "Whoa, hey, by yourself." "What's he gonna do?" laughs Ezran. "I'm the king. Go. It'll be fine." X. Balin's still fuming when he bursts into the Crow Lord's tower, scrunched letter in hand. The nerve of that elf. How dare she? How dare they? Callum may be a prince and an archmage, but he had no business disrespecting him over an elf. Balin didn't spend decades sending his forces to the breach to keep the Pentarchy safe for this. He hurls the letter at the Crow Master with a scowl. "Where's the Crow Lord?" he snaps. The Crow Master arches an eyebrow at him. In Evenir for business, General," he stammers. "Who am I sending this to?" Balin scowls. "General Amaya," he sneers. "I need it sent to her as soon as possible." The Crow Master studies him, the corners of his mouth pulling downwards in uncertainty, but he doesn't object. "I can have it done this afternoon, General." "Good," Balin snaps. "And I want to be notified as soon as she responds." "Yes, sir." Balin huffs, his displeasure settling just a little. "If the boys won't listen, fine. They'll listen to Amaya." And, at the very least, Amaya will listen to him. Notes. If it's not busy on tonight's shift, you guys might get one more within the day. Wish me luck. Prompts filled. From Tumblr user at @ThethyFanTheEbender, anything with Callum /Rayla being protective over each other. Chapter 10. Summary. What are we even doing this for, Callum? What's the point? Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. X. Rayla doesn't often take insults from people like Balin to heart, but it's not surprising that she does so today. Usually, on this side of the border, it's Rayla who keeps her cool, Rayla who calms him down and convinces him to let it go, even when she's the one who's been wronged. Today, she storms through the castle, throwing doors open in her wake, scowling at every guard who so much as looks at her wrong, while Callum trails after her muttering apologies to innocent passers-by. In all fairness, he's pretty peeved off too. He'd always known Balin was a tad old-fashioned, to put it politely, but what happened in the dining hall was a step too far. Rayla doesn't need him to defend her, but he'd interfered anyway because he'd seen her hand opening and closing by her side like she was ready to start throwing punches. As satisfying as it would have been to see it, the situation between elves and humans is precarious enough without that sort of stress. He waits until they're in the privacy of the stables before he reaches for her at last. "Hey," he says quietly, tugging her back and putting both of his hands on her shoulders. He studies her face and her posture, feels the tension set in her shoulders and hears the way her breath shakes as she lets it out. Callum doesn't think he's ever seen her so angry, and he can't even ask her to calm down, or to let it go, or convince her that everything's okay, because she has every right and more to be pissed off. "Tell me what to do," he manages at last, because there's nothing else he can say and this is all he can offer. "Tell me what to do to make you feel better and I'll do it." She shrugs his hands off. "It's fine," she says shortly. Don't worry about it. It's fine." "It's not." He hurries around her to block her off before she can stalk away, a grim determination rising in his chest. "He can't treat you like that. No one should be able to treat you like that, and, Rayla, I get it, okay? We've worked too long and too hard to get up in arms about it now, but there has to be something." "There's not," she snaps. "What are we even doing this for, Callum? What's the point? People like Balin are always going to exist and nothing we do is ever going to change their minds, not even if we go through with Ezran's stupid plan. I'm tired of this. Hey, look at me." He rubs her shoulders again with both hands and slides them up to cup her face, his thumbs brushing the edges of the warrior's marks on her cheeks. "It's worth it, Rayla. I promise you, it is. I've seen it." "I haven't." She won't look at him. "All I've seen is fighting and prejudice over the stupidest things, and Callum, we've been doing this 3 years and nothing's changed. People and elves still hate each other. Why even bother?" Callum ducks his head and tilts her face towards him, trying to catch her eye. She lets him, reluctantly, the hardness in her stare dissipating as she meets his gaze. "You should have been with me yesterday," he says quietly. "Things are changing for the better, and people like Balin can't stop it. Giving up now will." It's not until she touches his hands that he realizes how close he's brought them. Something builds inside him, an urge to bring them closer still, to press his lips against her forehead and hold her to him until her anger leaves her completely. It makes his heart hammer in his chest and his breath hitch in his throat. But she tugs his hands away from her face and he doesn't get the chance. "Rayla. Let's just go," she murmurs, pushing past him and taking a saddle off the rack between the stalls. "I can't be here today. X." She calls the filly Vorobei. Callum can hear her muttering to her as she saddles her. He's never been particularly good at horse riding himself and, in the past they've been happy to share, but there's a sense of privacy in Vorobei's stall, like Rayla can confide in her more comfortably than she can confide in him as she mounts up. Reluctant to interrupt, Callum leaves her to it, wandering a couple of stalls down to a gentle-looking mare. They saddle up in relative silence. Every now and then, Callum glances at her out of the corner of his eye, watching the way she goes about making ready and the swift precision of her actions. She and Vorobei seem fond of each other. There's a familiarity between them that he doesn't have with any of the horses in this stable, and Callum wonders to himself if she was the filly Ezran had wanted to introduce Rayla to. Rayla finishes up faster than he does. She mounts up and urges Vorobei outside without waiting for him, and Callum scrambles to catch up with her. His own mare is sweet-tempered, used to being ridden and forgiving when he pulls too tightly on her reins on his way up. When they trot outside, Rayla's agitation is mirrored in the way Vorobei stamps with her front hooves. "Lead the way," then she says shortly, tugging gently on Vorobei's reins. There's an odd sort of apprehension in her shoulders, Callum notes as he eases the mare past, but he doesn't ask. He pulls forward, reins wrapped tightly in his hands, a little afraid of falling off. They head off, Callum with caution, Rayla with grace, her hair fluttering behind her in the breeze as they ride into town. The crowds in the city part as they pass. Every now and then, someone frowns at them, more correctly, at Rayla, and Callum catches the way she draws her hood over her head as they ride. He wishes they were walking. At least then, he'd be steady enough to ward off the looks. It's a not too long a ride, faster than walking, certainly, but it feels longer than it is because of the way Callum clings to his mare. Relief floods his system when the story front of the wishbone comes into view. He slides off the mare, foot almost catching the saddle as he dismounts. "Come on," he says to Rayla, tugging the mare the rest of the way. Rayla follows him, her hood still up, her eyes downcast like she's dreading what might be inside. They leave the horses out front, and Callum ushers her inside first, his hand at the small of her back. Claudia's behind the counter today, and she greets them with a grin. "Back so soon?" she asks, stepping around the counter. Callum grins back, his shoulders relaxing a little now that they're out of the open. He accepts the hug that Claudia offers him and tugs Rayla forward, the glare gone from her face at last as her hood falls and she examines the inside of the shop. Claudia's grin widens, but she steps back and offers Rayla a polite curtsy. "Lady Rayla," she greets. Rayla blinks, catches sight of Claudia, a flicker of confusion and uncertainty crossing her face before it turns into a look of disgust. "Never call me that again," she says dryly. But her lips twitch upwards a little as she takes her in. Callum grins at them, pleased. He doesn't think they've ever had the opportunity be properly introduced, and while Claudia and Soren had spent an amount of time chasing them down before they returned ZYM, neither of them were bad people, and it's nice to see them in the same room as Rayla without them trying to kill each other. How are you?" Rayla asks her after a minute. Claudia has none of it. "Oh, come here," she laughs, pulling her into a hug. "It's good to see you." "Is it?" asks Rayla, still a little uneasy. "The last time you saw me, we were on opposite sides." "And we're not now," says Claudia. "Look how well you've been looking after Callum. How can I resent you knowing that?" She grins and pulls back. "Come with me. I know a certain little girl who's going to lose her mind that you're here." Lesser loses her mind, all right. Her eyes go wide as Claudia leads them both onto the landing of Alis and Eleni's apartment, and she abandons the tea party she's having with her mother entirely to stare in awe at Rayla. "Lady Rayla," she murmurs, curtsying gracelessly. Whatever irritation Rayla might have had left over from breakfast leaves her in a rush, her lips pulling into a delighted smile as she crouches in front of Lesser. "You don't have to call me that, little one," she says. "Just Rayla's fine. You must be the little lady Lesser. Prince Callum's told me all about you." Lesser nods eagerly, golden eyes filled with admiration. Inwardly, Callum thinks that it's a little unfair how much Lesser likes her. Yesterday, she'd been determined to hide behind Soren until she decided he was worth liking. There's none of that today. She has eyes for no one else as she toddles forward to grasp Rayla's fingers in hers. "Will you have tea with me and my mama?" "Of course," says Rayla, allowing herself to be pulled forward. It'd be rude to refuse an invitation from such a distinguished lady. "Guess I can say goodbye to being her favorite aunt," mutters Claudia under her breath. Callum snorts. "I don't think anyone really had a chance against Rayla," he chuckles, watching them fondly. "Probably." Claudia rolls her eyes and heads for the kitchen. "Can I get you some tea?" Callum tears his eyes from them. "Tea would be great." "You seem quiet," Claudia says, setting his tea in front of him. He's sitting at Ayla's and Eleni's dining table. In truth, he'd been watching Rayla. She's at the little table in their living room with Lesser chatting happily away in her lap. It's the first time he's looked at her since breakfast that she hasn't had a scowl fixed on her lips, and the first time she's looked properly at ease since Ezran had given them his proposition. She's pretty when she smiles, something he thinks he's always known, but something he only admits to himself now because she's been so stressed the past couple of days. Quiet how? Claudia shrugs, settling in the seat opposite him. Tough morning. Callum snorts. Little bit, he mutters into his teacup. I won't ask, then chuckles Claudia. She drops a sugar cube into her tea and rests her chin in her palm. I remember when you used to look at me like that. Callum almost chokes on his tea. Sorry. She smiles at him, wistful and knowing, rueful and happy, all at once. Back before the war ended, when no one knew when it might end, my dad told me to come to terms with the idea that I might end up having to marry you one day. It made sense, right? I was a nobleman's daughter, you were the step-prince with an obvious crush. She smirks at him. I was just a kid, mutters Callum, hiding the flush on his cheeks with his teacup. Claudia chuckles. It's only been 3 years, Callum. She sighs and slurps at her tea. I didn't hate the idea, you know. You were a sweet kid and we were friends. And me, being a nobleman's daughter, any marriage I would have had would have been political, and marrying you probably would have been the best case scenario. Thanks. I think. She laughs. I don't want to tell you what you're feeling, she says carefully. But you need to think about this. Really think about this, and whether or not you, both of you, think it's as bad as you think it is, or as good as Ez says it might be. And, before you say anything, I know you haven't had the chance to really think about it or talk about it. But, here's the thing, Ezran's your brother. He would never ask you to do anything that would make you unhappy. She pauses and nods at Rayla. Would a life with Rayla make you unhappy? The question is heavy, and it settles in Callum's stomach like lead. He knows what the answer is, he thinks, but he's hesitant to admit it because he knows what Claudia's next question will be, why? He doesn't think he's ever been introspective enough to answer that. Claudia chuckles at him. It's just something to think about, she says when he says nothing. She sips delicately at her tea and gets up to join Lesser's tea party, leaving Callum speechless and alone at the dining table. Notes. Hey, so a bunch of people keep telling me that they think it's amazing I update so quick, but guys, you're the amazing ones. You have been nothing but supportive and encouraging, and I update so quickly to say thanks. I mean, damn. This is literally the most supportive fandom I've ever been in, and I do it because there's no other way to show you my gratitude for all your kind words. You guys are honestly amazing and I love you all. Please accept my offerings, it's all I have. Chapter 11. Summary. You can't tell him, she mutters. He can't know. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. 11. What's Zadia like? It's Claudia who asks, and Rayla's hands still in Lesser's hair. They are on the cushioned chaise lounge in the corner of Ayla's and Eleni's living room, Lesser in front of her, her little fingers combing the tangles out of a doll's hair, Claudia behind her, perched carefully on the raised backrest as she braids Rayla's silver locks. It's Lesser's idea. Eleni had gotten up a while ago to start on lunch with Callum's help, and Lesser had insisted. She'd been enjoying the attention, and despite the newness of their friendship for this sort of familiarity, who were they to refuse such a sweet little lady? Rayla hums thoughtfully. It's different, she says, tying off a braid in Lesser's hair. Not any more vibrant or beautiful. I've seen enough of the human kingdoms now to know that being on this side of the border doesn't immediately make something less good. It's just different. That's not what Ayla says, chuckles Claudia. I asked him once. He makes Zadia sound like this unreal place, where magic is everywhere you look. Whenever he goes and he brings back stuff for the shop, it's always really fascinating to go through it all beforehand. Not for dark magic, I hope. Rayla means it as a joke, but too late, she wonders if perhaps it's a little early in their relationship for it. Claudia laughs anyway, unoffended. No, I'm done with that, she chuckles. Dark magic is expensive, comparatively. How so? Claudia takes her own turn to pause, her fingers deft and gentle as she tugs on the hair behind Rayla's ears. Callum describes it as a shortcut, she says finally. And it is, for the little things. You could take something magical and use its life force for convenience. From a certain perspective, that's already plenty expensive, but for something as serious as Soren's back, it's much, much worse. It took a lot of magical energy, and a lot of physical energy. Her fingers pause as she shakes out her bun, pins between her teeth, to show Rayla the white streaks that run through her hair. It took a lot out of me. I still don't really know what sort of long-term effects it might have had, and, even then, the longer I did it to help Soren, the less effective it was, you know. Oh. Rayla presses her lips together, a little unsure on how to respond. I'm sorry, I guess. Don't apologize, laughs Claudia, returning to her work. I didn't know. My dad used to say it wasn't any different from eating meat or using leather. It is, though. When someone hunts for food, they do it for sustenance, not convenience, and when it came down to it, I don't think he ever considered the cost it might have on him. Plus, when you get to know someone as sweet as Lesser, it doesn't ever really cross your mind again. Isn't that right, sweetie? Lesser giggles, turning her head just slightly to give them a happy grin. Can we help? Asks Rayla after a moment. Callum told me about how the charm Malus made for Soren might stop working someday. Claudia sighs wistfully. Not really, she says, and Rayla can hear the note of remorse in her voice. There might be something more effective in Xadia, but after all the things I've done, I don't know that we'll ever get that chance to look for ourselves. Don't feel bad, though, she adds quickly. Things are already better for us, and in part, it's because you and Callum made it possible for Aelus to open up shop here to begin with. You've helped plenty. Rayla shakes her head, unsatisfied. She understands now why Claudia and Callum had been such good friends in their youth, understands, even, why he'd had, might still have, she corrects herself, a crush on her. She's not a bad person. Everything she'd done because she thought it would help people, and she didn't realize, at the time, how far gone her father already was. She'd watched him, had learned from his mistakes, and she and Soren are better off for it now, even if it did mean such significant fall from grace. You know, I came pretty close to giving up on this ambassador thing today, Rayla admits to her quietly. What? Why? Rayla shrugs. Just some things General Balin said. Claudia snorts at her, not in the least bit surprised. I always hated that guy, she says. Treated everyone like they were beneath him. Seriously can't believe Ezran hasn't fired him. He hasn't done anything wrong. Not technically, anyway. Rayla shrugs once more, but she doesn't hide the fact that she's amused. It's nice to know it isn't just her. In any case, once this dumb arranged marriage thing blows over, we'll take you. To Xadia, I mean. Claudia lets out a laugh. Would you really, she says, sounding breathless in disbelief, sincerity, and gratitude all at once. It's enough to convince Rayla that this bridge is mended once and for all. I think we might take you up on that. She ties off Rayla's braid at last and pats her shoulders. All done. What do you think, Lesser? Lesser swivels around. Her face splits into a grin, her golden eyes filling with admiration only a 3-year-old might have, before she claps her hands excitedly. You made Lady Rayla so pretty. She's always pretty, says Claudia with a pleased smile. She takes a pin from between her lips and uses it to fix a stray lock of hair behind Rayla's ear, just as Callum steps out of the kitchen with a tray of roast potatoes. Isn't she pretty, Callum? Callum falters. Flushes. Stares for just a moment too long before he ducks his gaze and looks down at the tray. Yeah, he murmurs. She is. It's nice, Rayla thinks, to have company other than Callum. It's not something she's ever really considered because, until now, she's never needed company other than Callum. It's a little bit their own fault and a little bit everyone else's, mostly everyone else's, but they've been traveling together and looking after each other for so long that they haven't really needed anyone else. She's grown used to him, and he to her, but in the complexity of their situation, Claudia's company is refreshing. There's one thing that bothers her, though. She's hesitant to bring it up. Claudia does it for her when Callum heads downstairs to help Eleni with the shop. I know what you're thinking, she says quietly, careful not to disturb Lesser, who's curled up and half asleep against Rayla's chest. There's nothing to worry about. That ship sailed a long time ago. Rayla blinks at her, trying to feign confusion, but she looks away too fast and gives herself away. She can't have been that obvious, surely. She'd spent the day wearing out Lesser, she hasn't even had the chance to speak to Callum, let alone make the nature of her feelings for him obvious to anyone. Claudia offers her a kind smile. What, you think I didn't notice? I see the way you look at him. Rayla swallows, but Lesser's so comfortable and sleepy now that she can't even get up to escape this conversation. You can't tell him, she mutters. He can't know. Why? Rayla hesitates. She shifts her hold on Lesser, hoping secretly that she might wake so they can talk about something else. Stares at the stairwell, wondering if Eleni, or even Callum, might come back upstairs so she can avoid this conversation. They don't. She sighs and brushes Lesser's hair out of her face. We're just friends, she tells Claudia finally. I'm not ruining that. What on earth makes you think you'll ruin it? Rayla cuts herself off. She winces, her breath hitching in her throat, her heart pounding so loudly in her chest that she's sure she'll disturb Lesser. There's panic building in her system, because Claudia's caught her out, and Claudia catching her out is a danger to the facade she's been trying so hard to rebuild. I'm not risking it. Please, Claudia, he can't know. But, Rayla. No. She sucks in a shuddering breath and the panic gets the better of her, the words spilling out of her like a burst dam, like she's been waiting to talk to someone, anyone, about the ache in her chest, and the mess she's found herself in. It hurts, she admits quietly. It does. But he looked ready to start a fight with Balan this morning just for insulting me. Can you even imagine how he might react if he thought for a minute that he was the one causing me pain? He can't fix this, not in any way that would help. Something creaks in the shop, and Rayla's breath catches in her throat, her eyes flitting to the stairs like she's afraid Callum might appear at any moment. She sighs when he doesn't. I already put myself through a whole day without him and, Claudia, I can't do that again. I won't do that again, because I know what it did to me, and I know what it did to him. He's happy thinking we're just friends, and him being happy is all I want, even if it kills me, okay? She kind of expects Claudia to be shocked, or surprised, or something, but she's none of those, and instead, she smiles like she expected nothing else. You really do love him, don't you? Rayla doesn't think she's ever really admitted it to herself in so many words, let alone someone else. Something like anguish crosses her face because it does hurt, and it hurts more acknowledging it and knowing it's unrequited. But there's no denying it now. Not to Claudia, who'd seen past her carefully crafted walls and who's looking at her now with a soft understanding she didn't realize she needed from someone else. Yeah, she whispers at last. I do. X. They head back to the castle in the late afternoon. Claudia hugs them both and presses a rounded piece of glass about the size of her palm into Rayla's hands. There are runes inscribed on the edges, and Rayla squints at it, unsure what it is. Right into it if you need to talk, Claudia tells her quietly. It doesn't matter, Callum's only standing a couple of feet away and they can see the way he pauses to listen, but Rayla's fingers close around it regardless. Thank you, she murmurs, accepting one more hug from her. We'll visit again soon, probably. You'd better. Claudia grins at them both and waves as they mount up, Rayla on Vorobei, Callum a little unsteadily on his mare. See you, she bids. They set off with another wave, side by side this time, knees bumping together as they urge the horses towards the castle. The end of her braid bounces gently against her shoulder as they ride, and she feels Callum's eyes fall on her once, twice, 3 times, before she rolls her eyes and gives him a look. What? Callum flushes, but he takes a slow breath, untangles one of his hands from the reins, and touches the end of her braid. You look nice, he says quietly. The proximity of his hands to her face feels almost too much for her, and she nudges Vorobei away and keeps her eyes on her mane. The little glass tablet feels heavy in her pocket, a reminder that she has someone to talk to later, if she needs it, and she finds herself grateful for her newfound friendship with Claudia once more. Thanks, she mutters. Do you feel better? A little, she thinks. She's still mad at Balin, but her admission to Claudia keeps replaying in her head. She loves him. She loves him. And he doesn't love her. Not in the same way. Yeah, she lies at last. Much. X. Amaya receives the letter in the evening. She frowns at Balin's handwriting, reads over it twice before she actually takes it in, thinking she might have misunderstood, but the words are clear. King Ezran intends for Prince Callum to marry the elf. She gets up. Make ready to leave, she signs to Gren. We need to be in Catullus. Notes. Y'all can pry Rayla and Claudia's future friendship out of my cold dead hands. Chapter 12. Summary. We're pretty close for just friends, Callum. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. 12. You took your braid out. So I did. Oh. It's a shame, Callum thinks, but he doesn't say it out loud. It looked nice on her. Not that he'd gone out of his way to notice, nor is it to say that she doesn't always look nice, but it did look nice, and he'll admit that much happily. They're on their way to breakfast this morning. Rayla's hair still has leftover waves from the braid Claudia had put into it, and it falls around her face in a curtain of silver that makes it hard to look away. He's glad he'd taken her out to the wishbone yesterday, she'd needed it, he thinks, and she seems altogether much less tense than she has been, but it's his shoulders that are stiff now as Claudia's words sit heavy in his head. Would a life with Rayla make you unhappy? The answer is no. No, it wouldn't. He'd known that when she'd asked it, but the why of it has been playing on his mind all night and he still doesn't have an answer. He shrugs his shoulders, trying to push the question out of his mind for even just a moment of peace only for it to be replaced, instead, but Ezran muttering curses to himself when they let themselves into the dining hall. Whoa, there, Your Majesty, says Rayla, her tone dry and amused. Those are hardly words a young king should be using. Ezran scowls at them both and thrusts a letter into Callum's face. Callum frowns at it. He knows who it's from before he even looks at the broken seal at the edge of the parchment. His aunt's handwriting is unmistakable, but whatever pleasant feelings a surprise letter from Aunt Amaya might have inspired are lost as he skim-reads her letter. He blanches at the final line. Commander Gren and I expect to be in Catullus within the week to congratulate Prince Callum on his apparent engagement. It's honestly amazing how much sarcasm Aunt Amaya can put into a letter. Callum presses his lips together. He hands the parchment off to Rayla, watches her eyes widen as she reads it, and holds back a mirthless laugh when she brandishes it at Ezran, looking mortified. What, she snarls, in the name of the bloody moon is this supposed to be? What it looks like, says Ezran sharply. Someone told Aunt Amaya about your apparent engagement and now she's coming here to congratulate you both, by which I think she means she's not happy and she's coming to talk you out of it. He snatches the letter back from Rayla with another scowl. There's nothing to talk us out of, snaps Rayla. We haven't agreed to anything. There is no engagement. Callum grimaces, rubs his hands over his face and breathes slowly into steepled fingers, trying to keep his patience. Who even knows that would tell her? Ezran snorts at him. You know exactly who. There's a pause. Then Rayla snarls. There have been a couple of times already where Callum's seen the way her hands have twitched towards her blades, both out of habit and out of frustration, but when they twitch this time, she actually does reach for them, and she flicks one into its sword form before Callum has the sense to even think about stopping her. I'm going to murder him, she seethes, turning on her heel. Whoa. Rayla. Callum seizes her elbow and tugs her back to him, fingers prying hers from the hilt of her blade one at a time. Hey, it's not that bad, okay? You've met Aunt Amaya. She tried to kill me once. So did Claudia, and now look how much you like each other. He eases the weapon from her entirely, flicks the blade back into its hilt, and presses it back into her hands. Her fingers are soft, something he'd never noticed despite all the times he's held them. He lingers for just a moment too long before Rayla tugs her hand out of his grip to put the weapon away, and he remembers his question. When's she supposed to get here, he asks Ezran. Ezran glances back down at the letter. It just says within the week. Callum grimaces a little. Within the week could mean anything. She might turn up this afternoon if the messenger bird this letter was sent with took a data on the way to Katolis. In any case, this visit has been stressful enough for Rayla, and he reaches for her hands again, determined to ease her nerves. He tells himself that it's what he would normally do, and not at all because he wants to know if her skin has always been that soft or if it's a brand new development. "Let me teach you to sign," he offers at last. "It'll help." "What, so I can understand her when she insults me?" "Rayla." Callum sighs patiently, his thumbs rubbing circles into the backs of her hands. "You trust me, right?" She scoffs, meeting his gaze for a second before she looks away and pulls her hands out of his. Callum thinks he catches a flicker of something in her eyes, but it's gone when she shrugs. "I suppose. It'll help," says Callum with a smile. "I promise." X. They end up on the North Tower again, sitting cross-legged and facing each other in the same spot they'd camped out in the other night. He hadn't dismissed the guards this time, but Rayla had enjoyed the way he'd taunted them before he slammed the trapdoor shut. "I'm teaching her ladyship sign language in case any of you want to gossip to General Balin," he'd snapped, and Rayla had hidden a snort in her hand. He starts her off on easy phrases. "Hello, nice to meet you, please don't call me that," on Rayla's request, because she knows from the get-go that formality means General Amaya might refer to her as Lady Rayla to her face, and she'd really rather she didn't. She catches on easily enough, but they run into problems when he tries to teach her the alphabet. "I don't think this was meant for people with 4 fingers," she says dryly. Callum grimaces. "I mean," he says, signing as he speaks to help her pick it up faster. "It's not the worst-case scenario. She can read lips just fine, and she'll get what you're trying to say." "I could just not," says Rayla pointedly. Callum signs that for her too, and she tries to follow along. "I realize it's the effort that counts, but I don't want to accidentally say something rude, either." "Yeah, that'd probably be good," snorts Callum. "You're doing really well though." He leans over to correct the positioning of her hands, his fingers lingering a little too long, his face coming a little too close. Rayla tries not to wince, her heart pounding in her chest like it wants him to notice. "It'll pass," she tells herself, fighting the urge to pull away. In some ways, admitting to her feelings has made it easier, because at least, now, she understands why this is so hard in its entirety. In other ways, it's made it harder still, because he's only grown more casually affectionate since the other night, and she's had to spend the whole time pretending his touch doesn't kill her. He pauses. "Are you okay?" he asks, hands stilling, frown forming on his brow. He leans over again, this time to brush the still sort of wavy hair out of her face. Rayla swallows, and actually does pull away. "Fine," she says, signing it as a reminder of what they'd come up here to do. She hopes he doesn't notice her hesitance. X. He does notice. Of course he does, he knows her too well and has known her for too long not to. He stops signing entirely to frown at her. "You've been saying you're fine a lot," he points out. "Are you actually?" "Yes," says Rayla, but Callum watches her carefully now, catching the same flicker of something in the pale violet of her eyes he thought he'd seen this morning. He shuffles forwards, knees bumping against hers, and takes her hands in his. She sucks in a breath through her teeth, a gasp that doesn't go any further than her throat, and Callum feels the way her hands tense in his. He pauses, wondering if she might pull away from him again. He thinks inwardly. How often has she been pulling away from him that he's wondering if she'll do it again? She doesn't, but he still notes the shadow that crosses her face, like it's taking more effort to be still than she wants to admit. "I know this visit's been hard," he tells her, his voice soft. "But you can talk to me, Rayla. You know you can." "I know," she mutters. She snorts to herself. "Just once, I want a day where Balin minds his own business, and now there's this thing with your aunt," and she shakes her head, tugging her hands out of his grip, and shifting back to draw her knees under her chin. "I'm just tired, Callum." His frown deepens. He'd attributed the last couple of times she'd shied away from his touch to the circumstances, but there's a pattern now, one that he can't mistake for anything else. "Why won't you let me touch you?" he asks without thinking. She winces, freezing like a deer caught in a trap, and he knows her aversion to him is intentional. She swallows. I just thought it might be where Balin might be getting his ideas, she mumbles. Callum makes a face at her. Who cares about what he thinks? We're just friends. We're pretty close for just friends, Callum. Her voice is quiet, her eyes conflicted and locked on her knees. She's right and he knows it. Just friends don't have the sort of intimacy he's grown used to. They don't hold hands, or cuddle together under blankets, or hold each other's faces, or brush each other's hair out of their eyes. It's probably where Ezran had gotten the idea to propose their marriage, where Soren had gotten the idea that they might be more than what they are, and certainly where Balin had gotten the idea that they'd done more than talk the other night. They should cut back. He should cut back. But the idea of not being close, of not being able to hold her hand to calm her or hold her close to comfort her, or just because he can, is not one that he likes. Sorry, he mumbles, scooching back. The very action pulls at his chest. It's fine, she says quietly. She's using that word again. Deep in his mind, he has a suspicion that it's not. X. Balin draws the spyglass away from his eye. He's on the East Tower. He'd seen Prince Callum and the elf making their way to the North Tower, the elf's preferred spot in the castle to think, he's been told, and curious, he'd climbed to the top of his own tower to watch. Teenagers, he snorts to himself. They couldn't be any more obvious if they tried. But there's something interesting about this morning's interaction. The elf is shrinking into herself, pulling away from His Highness like she can't handle his affection. Her anguish is obvious, even through a spyglass, and Prince Callum hasn't noticed. Could it really be that easy? An elf obviously in love with a prince who thinks they are just friends. Who treats her with the same affection he always has without knowing how much it kills her inside. Balin lets out a laugh. How tragic, he says to himself, amused. How tragic indeed. Notes. Prompts filled. From me, Callum teaching Rayla to sign. I can do my own prompts if I want. Chapter 13. Summary. With all due respect, Your Majesty, Gren interprets. What the actual, he makes a face at Amaya. Heck. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. 13. It's a struggle. Callum doesn't realize how often he touches her until he forces himself not to. It's strange, not reaching for her fingers when he leaves her at her door before bed, not ushering her into rooms by the small of her back, not even touching her shoulder when she needs the comfort, and she's needed it, multiple times just this week. She's tired. He can see it in the slump of her shoulders and the dullness in her eyes. Their trips to Katolis are usually less taxing, but Ezran's proposal, and Balin's interference, and Aunt Amaya's impending visit have taken a collective toll. It's hard for him, too, but it's not the same. His authority as prince and archmage keeps the brunt of Balin's disdain off him at least, but it means Rayla has to take its full force instead. Callum wishes there was something, anything, he could do to make this easier for her, but she's removed even his ability to offer physical comfort, so now there's not even that. He misses the softness of her skin against his fingers, and her hair against his cheek, misses her lame jokes, and the spark in her eye when she smiles, and the sound of her laughter and the way it fills his chest with warmth. He just misses her. Even when she's standing next to him, she feels like she's miles away, and he can't even close the distance between their hands to remind himself that she's still there. Their lessons in sign language are starting to feel stilted. Callum's been having her sign along with their every conversation, but it feels like she has less to say every day. When he asks if she's okay, her answer is always the same, fine. Everything's fine, Callum. But he knows now that it's not, and he has nothing to offer her to make it so. It sucks. He hates seeing her like this, and he hates not being able to do anything about it even more. All the while, the why plagues him. Why does he care so much? Why is it so important to him that she's happy? Why does he miss her at all? Because she's his friend and he cares about her, he reasons at first, but the logical part of his brain rebuts him. He cares about Ezran too, but he doesn't spend every waking moment wanting to hold him close. What's so different about Rayla? He knows the answer, he thinks. He's just afraid to admit it. X. The day a messenger interrupts them on the North Tower to notify them that Aunt Amaya has arrived in the city, Rayla pales so fast that he thinks she might throw up. She swallows audibly, wringing her hands in front of her as she gets to her feet. Her breath comes short as she paces to calm herself down. "Hey," he says. He has to stop himself from catching her shoulders, from pulling her close and pressing his forehead to hers to assure her. "Hey, it's okay. It's gonna be okay. It's just Aunt Amaya." "To you, maybe," she snaps. "She hates me." "She doesn't," insists Callum. "She's met you once and that was before the end of the war, and she thought you'd kidnapped me and Ez. Come to think of it, we probably should have gone to see her at least once, I mean it's been 3 years. Callum. "Right, yeah." His hands twitch towards hers a second time, but he stops himself at the last minute. "It's just Aunt Amaya. It'll be okay." Rayla groans and runs her fingers through her hair. "I wish this couple of weeks would just end." "It will," he says, promises. He pauses, just for a second, but he allows himself to reach for her at last. She stills, her shoulders warm against his hands, her skin soft under her fingertips. It makes his mouth feel dry and sends a jolt up his spine, and gods, he's missed her, and all he wants, even now, is to hold her close and really promise her that it's going to be okay. "Look," he tells her. "We're halfway there, and then we can put all of this behind us, and we can go to Zadia and see your uncles, and everything will go back to normal again, okay? We're gonna get through this." Rayla draws in a shaky breath, but, for the first time in days, she doesn't shrug his hands off. For the longest moment, Callum wonders if, hopes that, she'd maybe missed him too. He crooks his finger and tilts her chin up, takes in the violet of her eyes and the pink of her lips, feels his heart beating too quickly and too loudly in his chest. And then the moment is over, and Callum remembers that just friends don't do this, and that he's not supposed to be this close to her. "We should go," he murmurs. "Probably," says Rayla, looking away from him and prying her shoulders out of his grasp. She seems reluctant, but a shadow crosses her face and she steps away entirely. She tugs the trapdoor open without another word and disappears into the recesses of the tower with Callum trailing after her, his heart pounding in his ears. The nausea is almost overwhelming, but Rayla reminds herself that she's done scarier things than this before, and frequently, back in the day, and she holds her ground. She stands with Callum and Ezran at the castle gates, her hands folded neatly in front of her like the lady most of the castle guards think she is, missing the familiar weight of her blades at her back as General Amaya and Commander Gren climb off their horses to bow to Ezran. "You know you don't have to do that," laughs Ezran, hugging his aunt around her waist. "I hope the journey wasn't too long." Amaya chuckles, ruffles her nephew's hair, and signs in response. "It was long enough," interprets Gren. "We're glad to be back." They greet Callum next, Callum accepting his aunt's embrace with a smile while Rayla swallows the last-minute anxiety building in her throat. He ushers her forward with a fleeting hand at the small of her back. "You remember," Rayla says Callum, signing as he speaks. "The circumstances weren't so good last time, but she's been a great friend to me, and to Ezran, since before the end of the war." Amaya studies her, her eyes hard and cold, but after a moment, she and Gren place their hands over their hearts and bow to her the way they had to Ezran and Callum. "Lady Rayla," Gren greets her in Amaya's stead. His voice is stiff, the way Rayla imagines Amaya's voice might be if she didn't need him, but his face reflects none of her animosity. "Please don't call me that," says Rayla weakly, signing the words as she says them as best as she can despite her shaking fingers. "Just Rayla is fine." Amaya blinks at her, the twitch in her lips betraying the surprise on her otherwise stern expression. "You can sign," says Gren, looking pleasantly taken aback. Rayla nods. "Only a bit," she says. "Callum's been teaching me." Amaya smirks. Rayla thinks it looks almost unfriendly, but perhaps she only thinks so because she's so terrified. "Very good," says Gren, his tone cold on Amaya's behalf, his eyes flitting to her hands as he speaks. "I believe congratulations are in order." Interrupts Ezran. "Let's talk inside. I was hoping I could speak to you both in private before we do anything else." It'd be an otherwise quiet afternoon, Ezran thinks, but his aunt looks livid even as his crown guard vacate the throne room for their privacy. Inwardly, he thinks Rayla had done pretty well, he doesn't need to know her as well as his brother does to know that she'd been legitimately terrified of formally meeting their Aunt Amaya, especially under the, circumstances of their visit. It's nice to see that at least Gren doesn't dislike her on principle, but then Gren's always been the less scary of the two, and he'll admit that freely. Aunt Amaya can be scary, even to him and Callum, and Ezran waits until the throne room doors shut completely before he holds up his hands and reverts to being a 13-year-old instead of a king. Please don't be mad. It's not what you think. Amaya takes a patient breath, but her hands show her disapproval for the idea better than her face. With all due respect, Your Majesty, Gren interprets. What the actual? He makes a face at Amaya. Heck. Ezran winces. They haven't agreed to anything, he says. It was just an idea. I thought, maybe, if there was an example of an elf-human union that works, it might make negotiations easier. No one was supposed to know until they made a decision. Amaya frowns at him. I understand the sentiment, says Gren, watching her hands. But why does it have to be Callum? Because he was always going to have to marry for the realm anyway, says Ezran, like it's the most obvious thing in the world. At least this way, he'll get to marry someone who might actually make him happy. But an elf. Her name is Rayla, says Ezran sharply. And yes, it has to be them. They're already friends, they already care about each other more than they know how to say. He pauses to study his aunt, unsure if he should divulge information when it's not his to tell, but Amaya still looks unhappy about the idea and he decides she needs to know. They love each other, he tells her quietly. They love each other a lot, and if they can work through this, they could make each other really happy. Isn't that what you want for Callum? Amaya's frown deepens. You can't make those sorts of assumptions, Ezran, says Gren on her behalf. It's not an assumption, says Ezran firmly. Callum's not all the way there yet, but Rayla loves him and she can make him happier than anyone else ever could. She told you this? Ezran falters. Well, no, but she did tell Claudia. Viron's daughter. Are you serious? Ezran sets his jaw. He can feel his patience wearing thin, and as much as he respects his Aunt Amaya, he's tired of outdated world views. He gets enough that from Balan, and he'd rather not get it from his aunt too. Things are different now, he says, a finality on his features that he hopes will keep Amaya from arguing. The war's over, and whether they go through with it or not is their decision and no one else's. Amaya shakes her head. I can't agree with this. It's not up to you. He gives her a hard stare, the one he usually reserves for Balan when he's being a nuisance. And, as your king, he takes a breath. I'm ordering you to get to know her first. Give her a chance, Aunt Amaya, please. She's not a bad person just because she's an elf, and whether or not Callum could be happy with her should be the only thing that matters. Amaya signs nothing. Ezran wonders for a little while if she's really that mad, but in the end she relents. Fine, Gren says for her. I'm still not happy. Try to be, insists Ezran. They ended a 1000-year war together. You owe it to them to try. Notes. Prompts filled. From an anon on Tumblr, Rayla meets Aunt Amaya. **** I know how much you guys wanted Amaya to automatically be on board, but I really think that her being immediately supportive this early in the game would be out of character for her. Give her time. She's here to cause tension, not conflict, and I promise you all that she'll come around. Please just be patient with me. Chapter 14. Summary. Yeah, she hates me. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. 14. Yeah, she hates me. She doesn't hate you. She does. Rayla scowls at him. She's pacing in the courtyard, and twice now, she's tried to reach behind her for blades that aren't there out of a need for something to fidget with. Callum watches her patiently from where he sits cross-legged on the stone steps, his sketchbook open but forgotten on his lap. If she were being totally honest, then no, her first formal meeting with General Amaya and Commander Gren was not a total disaster, but neither is she an idiot, and she's familiar enough with staring and glaring now to know dislike when she sees it. The hardened gaze, the downturned lips, the little smirk that had followed after her shaky attempt at sign, Amaya's feelings may not be as severe as she makes them out to be, But she's not happy, either, and Rayla can only imagine why. "You're catastrophizing a little," says Callum, shutting his sketchbook altogether. "Am I?" snaps Rayla. "Callum, the last time your aunt saw me, you told her I'd kill you and drink your blood." Callum winces. "Well, I mean, you clearly haven't," he says. He jerks forward awkwardly, like he wants to grab her wrist but changes his mind about it at the last second. He pats the space next to him instead. "I'm sorry," he offers. "I know it was years ago, but what I said back then was uncalled for, especially if it's affecting Aunt Amaya's opinion of you now. Come and sit down. Please." Rayla scowls at him a second time, still disgruntled, but she obliges him anyway. He moves over for her, pressing his shoulder uncomfortably against the stone banister on his other side like he's being extra careful not to touch her. "She doesn't hate you," he says again. "She's apprehensive about you." "Very diplomatic," says Rayla with a derisive snort. "You're good at this ambassador thing." Callum makes a face at her, but he ignores the taunt. "I know she can be a little scary," he says slowly, "but you just need to get to know her, that's all. And she'll get to know you, and before you know it, you'll be getting along fine. I bet you she's already secretly impressed that you went to the trouble of learning to sign." "You didn't really give me a choice with that," grumbles Rayla. "Do you regret it?" She sighs. "No, I guess not," she mutters. "But, Callum, My lady. Your Highness." Rayla swallows a yelp, and she scrambles up in time to see Commander Gren standing over them with his helmet under his arm and a kind smile fixed on his face. Quietly, she thinks he's a little bit reminiscent of a puppy. He bows to her, and then to Callum, and behind him, Rayla catches sight of General Amaya, waiting for him at the top of the steps with her hands clasped primly behind her back as she overlooks the courtyard. "Commander Gren," she greets, as Callum gets to his feet too, fingers twitching almost defensively at his sides. She takes a breath. "You really don't have to call me that or bother with the bowing, but, what can we do for you?" Gren studies them, lips twitching upwards, amused little spark in his eye. "My apologies for disturbing you both. I just wanted to say hello informally. I know your uncle." Rayla stares at him, forgetting, for a moment, that Amaya is watching carefully from the top of the steps. "Which uncle?" I don't think he ever told me his name," Gren says awkwardly. "But I was told that he was part of the team that, he pauses, infiltrated the castle the night His Majesty found the egg. You know Ranan. Is that his name?" Gren grins at them. "We were locked in the same dungeon for some time, although I doubt he remembers me." Rayla racks her brain. Twice, she thinks, she'd heard Ranan mention a talkative red-headed human who was unfairly optimistic given the severity of their circumstances. She studies Gren with that in mind and wonders how she ever found him as intimidating as Amaya. "He remembers," she says, fighting a smirk. Gren's smile widens. He jerks his head at Amaya, making use of the fact that he has his back to her and she can't see his lips. "Don't let her scare you. She's just, as His Highness says, apprehensive. She is impressed, by the way. Your sign language is very good. How long have you been learning?" Rayla glances down at her feet. 3 days. "Very impressive indeed," says Gren. He glances up at Amaya and nods when she tilts her head just slightly towards the castle keep. "I won't keep you," he says to them. "But give your uncle my best." "My lady." "Your Highness." He bows to them both once more before he turns and jogs back up the rest of the steps to join Amaya. Rayla thinks she catches the sign for "my apologies" before they disappear around the corner and she lets out the breath she hadn't realized had caught in her throat. Callum nudges her with a satisfied smirk. "Well, she doesn't hate you." Despite herself, Rayla lets out a laugh. It's weak, and a little shaky, but it's the first time in days that she lets her shoulders relax at last because she's so relieved that there's at least one other person in this castle apart from Callum and Ezran that doesn't hate her on principle, that treats her like another person and not with stiff greetings because they don't know how else to act. It's not that she doesn't appreciate it from Callum and Ezran, on most days, it's all that keeps her sane, but it is refreshing to be treated so by someone else. "Gren doesn't hate me," she corrects him. "Your aunt still might." I promise you she doesn't, says Callum quietly. He chuckles too, and, probably against his better judgment and hers, he takes her hand in his. Warmth blooms in her chest at his touch, and there's a part of her that knows this will kill her later, but she wants this so much that she allows it, allows him to pull her close enough to slip an arm around her, and allows herself to rest her head against his shoulder and enjoy his proximity for the first time in days. Callum pauses, his thumb rubbing gently against the skin of her right shoulder. Are you okay? Fine, she tells him. She almost believes it, this time. What do you think? Amaya asks as Gren falls into step with her. He shrugs a little. She's a little afraid of you, he tells her. With respect, General, you can come off as intimidating. As I should, signs Amaya with a snort. Do you think what Ezran says is true? Gren pauses, his hands stilling in front of him as they walk. The corridor is otherwise empty, and there are few other people in this castle besides them, Callum, and now, the elf, who know how to sign, but Amaya gets the feeling that he wants to be as respectful of their privacy as he can. I think Prince Callum cares for her a great deal, he signs at last. He's protective of her, I think, and she of him. It's difficult to say, beyond that. Amaya grimaces. She doesn't approve, not in the least, but Ezran is right. It's not up to her, and the most she can do is hope that Callum does what's best for him. What do you suggest? General. Amaya purses her lips. What do you suggest we do about all this? Gren gives her a look. He's never been particularly outspoken, but she knows from the look on his face that he disagrees. With respect, General, I suggest we do nothing. This is up to them, and if Prince Callum has an opportunity for happiness with her ladyship, how can we object? You agree with Ezran then? It's not my place to disagree with His Majesty, signs Gren shortly. Amaya lets out a sigh because she knows he's right. It bothers her a lot. The near 2 decades she'd spent commanding forces at the breach have not colored elves kindly in her eyes, and even now, she has trouble accepting that they are no longer at war. But the elf, her ladyship, she corrects herself, has been with Callum for a longer amount of time than she ever has, and Callum is fine and safe and happy, so what can she do? As far as she can tell, her ladyship means well, and, on top of that, Ezran had ordered her to try to get know her, so, grudgingly, try she will. They pass a corridor but Gren stops her, jerking his head slightly to the right. She turns, frowning as General Balin flags them down and half jogs down the hall to meet them. General Amaya, he mouths. You've arrived. So I have, she signs, trusting Gren to interpret for her. You received my letter then. I wouldn't be here otherwise. She smirks at him. How can I be of service to you, General Balin? Balin straightens importantly, drawing himself to his full height like it matters. King Ezran's proposal to arrange Prince Callum's marriage to the elf, he begins. It's outrageous. We cannot allow him to proceed with it. You are aware, signs Amaya, that, as king, Ezran is allowed to do whatever he wishes. Balin huffs at her. You must understand, General. Prince Callum cannot marry the elf. It would ruin him. It would ruin us. Katolis would become the laughingstock of the 5 kingdoms. This marriage cannot occur. Amaya's lips twitch into an unamused smile. She understands. She understands better than anyone, but while this proposed marriage thing irritates her, the idea that Balin thinks he might have any bearing on her nephew's lives and decisions irritates her more. She's never liked him. Her knowledge of him is that he thinks of himself as far too important for someone who's spent most of his life warm and comfortable in Katolis while also sending troops to her so she can watch them die in his stead. She weighs her options carefully, trying to decide if it's worth being honest and letting him think he's in the right, or if it might be altogether more enjoyable to watch him squirm despite her opinion on Ezran's proposal. She forces down a snort. General, she signs, as far as I'm aware, no plans have been finalized at this stage. Prince Callum has yet to agree to anything, and until he does, there's nothing to stop. In the meantime, am I to understand that you sent me that letter without the knowledge or approval of His Majesty, the King? Balin frowns at her. I don't see how that's relevant, General. It's plenty relevant, General Balin, signs Amaya. Because my understanding of this situation is that you undermined the authority of both my nephews, one of whom is the king you serve, to summon me to Catullus for a proposal that hasn't even been finalized. Balin pales a little. She sneers at him. You ought to be careful. Some might call that conspiring against the crown. Good day. She turns on her heel, beckoning for Gren to follow her, only to pause 2 steps later. She turns. The elf's name is Rayla, by the way. You will refer to her as Lady Rayla, or her ladyship if you can't commit it memory. They turn again before Balin can object, and if he does, Gren doesn't sign it to her. Instead, Gren waits until they're well out of view before he stops her again. I thought you didn't approve, he signs. I don't, replies Amaya. She smirks. But I won't pretend I didn't enjoy every minute of that. Notes. Tilde having like 2 whole days off where I actually, take the days off is amazing tilde. Asterisk I have little to no experience writing deaf people, so if I did anything wrong, please let me know so I can correct it and keep it going for following chapters. Thanks team, asterisk. Chapter 15. Summary. You weren't ready for it, corrects Rayla. That's no one else's fault but your own. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. 15. It's not as hard as Rayla thought it would be. The longer she spends around Callum, the easier it gets to bear his touch. He's been careful around her, and while he doesn't understand why she's been shying away from him, he thinks he does, but he doesn't really. He respects her wishes enough to limit his affection appropriately. It makes his embrace, and the occasional brush of their hands something she can cherish without holding on to the hope that he might one day return her feelings, and that's okay with her. He's happy. And maybe it does still suck, and maybe one day he'll find someone that he loves the way she loves him, but at this stage, he's happy with their friendship, and knowing that gives her the chance to let go of these feelings now, before that happens and they kill her all over again. She's managing with that all right, she thinks, and on days when she doesn't, she has Claudia, her messages of support lighting up the little glass tablet that Rayla keeps on her nightstand. She's been more helpful than Rayla had ever dreamed she would be, and while Rayla's never been the sort to talk about her feelings, the outlet Claudia's tablet gives her soothes the ache in her chest and gives her a solace that no one else can. On top of that, the knowledge that General Amaya does not, in fact, hate her is also soothing. Her nerves have been a frazzled mess over the past week and a half, what with Callum, and Balin, and the force of nature that is Amaya herself, but Commander Gren's assurance and the sunniness of his overall disposition as he interprets behind his general settles the churning in Rayla's stomach whenever said general is in the same vicinity. The cold glare Rayla thought she'd been giving her morphs into something closer to cautious scrutiny, which, frankly, Rayla will take over hatred any day. Altogether, it feels like things are finally settling, and as the deadline for their decision approaches, Rayla feels relatively confident that she and Callum can both agree that they won't be getting married, and they can leave this debacle behind them and move on with their lives at long last. They are sparring in the courtyard today. It's Callum's idea, she'd teased him for it, obviously, are you that eager to lose, but it's been a while, and she imagines he'd thought the adrenaline might do her some good. He'd been right. She feels better right now than she has in ages, her heart pumping heavily in her chest for once because it's supposed to be, and not because Callum's standing too close to her. He watches her carefully from across the courtyard, brilliant green eyes reading her posture and her face as he flips her blade in his hand. She'd taught him how to use them years ago, when every second day was a fight for their lives and when he needed to be able to defend himself in case she couldn't do it for him. He's only gotten better since, his memory good for watching her movements and trying to copy them himself. It's a not-so-secret point of pride for her, that she'd taken Callum, the mess of a fighter that he was, and turned him into someone who can, at the very least, hold his own. It means he knows her fighting style better than anyone though, and he lowers the blade a little and cocks his head to the side. You're holding back. Rayla snorts at him. If I wasn't, you'd be dead, she jokes, nodding a little at Amaya, who's watching them surreptitiously from the shaded walkway. I don't know that your aunt would approve of that. What, you think I can't keep up? Callum's lips tilt into a lopsided smirk, and Rayla thinks her heart skips a beat. She ignores it, the way she's been ignoring everything else it's been doing. I think I don't want to die. She means it mostly as a joke, but while General Amaya doesn't hate her, she doesn't like her either. She darts forward while Callum's off his guard, swings a blow at him that he only just parries before he dodges back, his smirk turning into a something like a pout. "That's cheating," he mutters, on the defensive again. "You weren't ready for it," corrects Rayla. "That's no one else's fault but your own." She swings at him again, and he dodges once more, flicking the blade in his hand into its hook form and using it to block her. He pushes back, catching the nook of her blade in the hook of his and locking her into a shoving match she can't pull away from. Rayla scowls at him, pushing harder against his, determined to knock it out of his grip, but Callum holds his ground, teeth gritted in concentration, their faces so close that she can see the sweat on his brow and feel the shortness of his breath against her fingers, so close that she forgets how to ignore the fluttering in her chest. Callum sees the opening before she does. He ducks, lets the blade slip out of his grip and, without his resistance, Rayla stumbles forward as he ducks behind her and sweeps a leg at the back of her knees. She goes down with a yelp, huffing and frustrated and squinting against the afternoon sun as Callum grins over her. "Feel like you're the one who might not be ready for it." She groans and sits up. Under the shaded walkway, Amaya smirks, hands clapping lightly to applaud her nephew as she pushes herself off the wall to approach them. "Impressive," she signs. Callum has to interpret the rest. "I didn't think Callum had it in him," he says, before he scowls at his aunt. "Rude," he adds to her, signing as he speaks. "He's got it in him, all right," grumbles Rayla, only half signing her response. She doesn't quite know how to sign the whole sentence, but Amaya understands and holds out a hand to help her up. Rayla hesitates, but it's the warmest Amaya's looked at her since she arrived, and her eyes aren't even that warm. It's still an offer of peace though, so she takes the proffered hand, hoists herself up with a huff, and tries to dust off her back. "Did you teach him?" Callum asks in Amaya's stead, stepping behind her to help get the dust out of her hair. Rayla's breath hitches just a little as Callum's hand brushes the back of her neck and the skin of her shoulders, but she swallows whatever feelings are welling in her throat in a bid to act normal about it. Yes," she tells Amaya. "A while ago now, before the war ended." "She was worried," snorts Callum. He bends over to pick up her blades, flicks them both back into their hilts, and hands them to Rayla before he continues. "She thought I might need it in case I couldn't use magic." "Was she right?" "Only once," says Callum. His fingers drift to her hair to tug a bit of chipped stone out of the ends and Rayla stiffens, shuffles back as subtly as she can, before a look crosses Callum's face and his hand falls to his side. Amaya studies them both. Rayla thinks she sees a fleeting sense of understanding cross her face, but in the end, she nods. "Very good," she signs. "I thank you for looking after him," she adds to Rayla, almost but not quite grudgingly. "He wouldn't have gotten very far on his own, I think." Callum scowls at his aunt. "Thanks," he drawls, looking a little offended that his aunt would tease him so. In all fairness, Rayla thinks that it's a good sign. Amaya doesn't hate her, and she doesn't hate her enough to make fun of Callum in front of her. It's more progress than Rayla ever hoped to achieve over a couple of days, and while she's still a lot intimidated, there's something of an armistice there that she can't help but feel grateful for. He would have gotten on fine. Probably, she adds quickly, glancing at Callum from the corner of her eye with a cheeky smirk. She tucks the blades back into their sheaths at her back. "I should go and wash up." "General." She nods, feeling a little awkward, but altogether better about Amaya, and takes her leave. She feels Callum's eyes on her back, feels her heart hammering in her chest because she knows he'd wanted to spend the rest of the day with her, and for a split second, she considers letting him. She doesn't, in the end. Balin hears her coming from down the corridor, but he waits until she crosses his path before he catches her attention. He'd known there was a chance Amaya might side with the boys, and as she has, it's time to take matters into his own hands. "My lady," he greets, throwing in a bow for good measure. It irks him that he's expected to, but with any luck, it won't be for much longer. "May I have a word?" The elf groans, her pace quickening, but he falls into step with her anyway. "What do you want, Balin?" "Only to talk," he says. It's mostly true, and if he wants this plan to work, then he must be precise in his every action. "I wanted to apologize for any trouble I've caused you." She glances at him from the corner of her eye, a frown forming on her brow, distrust in her eyes. Sure, she says slowly, inching away from him. Balin presses on. I imagine this situation has been hard on the both of you, and my interference has not helped in the least. For that, I am sorry. I can only imagine how difficult it must be for you personally. So difficult, drawls the elf. More so with you here. It must hurt, he continues, laments, even knowing you love him and he doesn't love you in return. That stops her in her tracks, and Balin takes a moment to enjoy the panic that flashes in her eyes. Her shoulders tense, her jaw clenches, her eyes suddenly hard with the dread of knowing he knows her secret. He fights a smirk as she tries to wipe the emotion from her face. Interesting assumption you've made there, she says, trying for nonchalance and failing miserably at it. Balin shrugs. We all know the feeling, he tells her mildly. It's happened to the best of us. We fall in love with the wrong person, we ache and long for them, and it just gets harder and harder to deal with their presence and their touch, especially when they're as affectionate as His Highness is to you. In hindsight, I suppose it's for the better. Can you imagine what he might have to deal with from other members of court if you and he did go through with it? He's dealt with much worse, I can promise you that, snorts the elf, continuing on her way like she isn't shaken to her core. Still, says Balin. It'd be a lifetime of scorn and mockery, not just for you, but for him. Personally, I'd hate for any such strain on a relationship. Yes, well, no one's asking for your personal opinion, are they? Snaps the elf acidly. Lucky for you, I already know all this, so there's no actual need for you to keep talking. My apologies, my lady, he says. I can see that I'm just bothering you. I'll be on my way then. Just, he pauses, choosing his words carefully. I do understand. The ache can be unbearable at times. I couldn't deal with it myself, when I was in your situation a long time ago. In the end, I chose to leave. I'd hate for you to do the same, so, if you need anything. She scowls at him. I have a need for you to go away now, she seethes. If you don't mind, General. Of course. Balin bows to her once more, hiding the smugness of the smirk that graces his lips with the inclination of his head. My lady, he bids, turning on his heel and heading back down the hall, satisfied that, for once, things might go his way. Notes. We're in the home stretch now, folks. I have this last arc planned down to the letter, so with any luck, we'll be at the end soon. Chapter 16. Summary. It's, Rayla coughs to clear the lump growing in her throat. Callum knows. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. 16. Rayla's been telling herself she's fine so often this past week and a half that she's grown used to just ignoring the unease in her stomach around Callum, General Amaya, and Balin, but she's never felt so vulnerable, and it scares her. She shuts her bedroom door with shaking hands and leans her back against it, trying to collect herself, trying to remember what she'd come up here to do, trying to breathe, but all she can think about is Balin's voice, oily and insincere, as it whispers her own secret to her in her head. It must hurt, knowing you love him and he doesn't love you in return. Things had been going so well. She'd thought this was getting easier, that she was finally learning to let Callum go, but Balin's words ring clear and true, and the ache returns in full force, in spite of the terror flooding her system. How would he even know? She asks herself. When had she slipped up so miserably that Balin had seen through every carefully crafted wall she'd put up to protect herself from this? What had she done to give herself away? Had she stared for too long? Said too much? Accepted Callum's affection one too many times? She doesn't know. She's so unsettled that she can't even think clearly about it. All she does know is that it makes her skin crawl, and the idea that Balin had watched her actions closely enough to know something so personal, so intimate, makes her want to sit in a bath and scrub herself raw. She draws in a shuddering breath, trying to breathe the panic out of her system, but she's shaken, and scared, and so alone. She can't turn to Callum for obvious reasons, can't turn to Ezran because he's king and has duties more important than her feelings, can't even rely on Claudia and her little glass tablet because even if she did know, what could she do? And, worse still, Rayla knows it's a game, Balin had meant to scare her, and had fully intended to make her feel vulnerable and isolated from the two people who had any power against him, and it's worked. Balin's winning, and it's all she can do to keep her head above the water. She pushes herself off the door, paces around the room breathing careful, steadying breaths, trying to gain some semblance of control over her mind and her actions, before she stalks into the adjoining bathroom to pump water into the tub. She waits until it's full before she sets her weapons on the bed and shrugs off her clothes, tugging them from her body in a rush and leaving them in a heap on the floor. The water is chilly. It puts goose pimples on her skin, but she welcomes it, welcomes the feeling of something other than dread and heartache as she shivers and draws her knees to her chest. It's fine, she murmurs to herself, curling against the edge of the copper tub. It's fine. It's not, and she admits that freely now, as a sob forces its way out of her lungs. It starts to rain before dinner time. Callum had seen the clouds rolling in from his bedroom window,